Welcome to HistSleep. Today, we quietly enter a world where every gesture and word mattered. In the Victorian era, politeness and social rules shaped daily life. From London drawing rooms to small-town parlors. Here, silence often spoke louder than words, and even small breaches of etiquette could affect a family's reputation. Let us begin softly, remembering that in this world, to observe was as important as to act. A world where silence was considered a form of good manners. In the quiet streets of a Victorian town, the day began not with a rush of activity, but with a subdued awareness of what was considered proper. Windows were opened gently, curtains drawn back with care, and the first footsteps on the cobblestones were deliberately soft. The very air seemed to carry an unspoken understanding that silence was a form of respect, both to one's neighbors and to oneself. Conversations were measured, laughter, though present, was restrained, and even the clinking of teacups at breakfast followed a rhythm that suggested discipline more than delight. For those who lived under the strict guidance of Victorian social rules, the world was an elaborate stage, and every citizen a performer aware of the audience that was always watching. Young women, taught from an early age, learned that speaking too loudly, or in a tone deemed improper, could reflect not only upon themselves, but upon the entire family. Young men, similarly, were instructed to control their gestures, their words, even their expressions, to avoid unintentional offense. It was a society where silence carried as much weight as speech, and where restraint was considered a mark of intelligence and refinement. Even in the home, silence was carefully observed. Morning routines were conducted with a hushed efficiency. Maids moved from room to room with deliberate calm, polishing furniture, setting breakfast tables, and ensuring that every object was in its precise place. The sound of a broom against a wooden floor was softer than might be imagined today, measured and restrained, as if each sweep were part of a silent conversation with the house itself. Families were taught to eat with decorum, to sip tea without noise, to converse in tones that would not disrupt the quietude of the morning. Outside, the streets mirrored this disciplined stillness. Children were taught early on that running, shouting, or playing in ways that drew attention was not simply impolite, but morally questionable. Their education, often conducted at home or in small schools, emphasized reading, writing, and the development of poise. Lessons in posture, the careful folding of hands, the proper angle at which to bow or curtsy were part of instilling an understanding that one's behavior had consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Even a child's slip of the tongue could be remembered and commented upon in hushed tones, shaping their understanding of social hierarchy and expectation. Visiting another household was a lesson in observation. One did not arrive unannounced. One knocked quietly and waited patiently, sometimes for several minutes, before entry was permitted. Once inside, one's behavior was closely scrutinized. Sitting too forward, reclining too comfortably, or even failing to make the proper small talk could be seen as a breach of etiquette. And yet, these rules were rarely spoken aloud. Much of the understanding was intuitive, absorbed through careful observation and gentle correction. Silence, in these moments, was not emptiness, but communication in its most refined form. Even letters, the primary form of long-distance communication, followed an unyielding decorum. Every word was weighed, every phrase chosen to convey respect, propriety, or subtle intention. To write too casually, to include unnecessary embellishments, or to neglect formal greetings could result in social embarrassment, or worse, a slow erosion of reputation. Silence, too, was part of the letter's language. Pauses and omissions were meaningful. speaking volumes about a sender's judgment, character, and understanding of social nuance in gatherings, whether a modest family dinner or a more elaborate assembly. The rules of silence and measured speech dictated the rhythm of life. Conversation flowed cautiously, each participant aware of their own tone, the appropriate time to speak, and the proper length of response. Interruptions were frowned upon, and laughter, though permitted, was expected to be controlled, low, and almost self-conscious. In this world, the art of listening was elevated to a practice of morality and intellect, and those who mastered it could navigate social situations with subtle influence and grace. Even leisure activities adhered to these standards. Gentle walks in gardens, visits to the local park, and even attending theatrical performances required careful adherence to unspoken codes. Eyes were lowered when greeting strangers, steps were measured, and voices remained quiet. The very act of observation, watching without comment, noticing without interfering, was seen as a mark of sophistication and moral refinement. It was through silence that the most delicate of judgments were made, and through restraint that one's social standing could be preserved or enhanced. In the domestic sphere, the value of silence extended to matters of the heart. Courtship was a delicate negotiation of gestures, glances, and carefully chosen words. Young couples were rarely alone, and communication relied on subtlety rather than overt expression. A fleeting glance, a carefully timed smile, a moment of shared activity, all conveyed more than words could safely reveal. The most profound emotions were often expressed through silence, a pause pregnant with meaning, a restraint that signaled both respect and self-control. In schools and parlors alike, instruction emphasized not only knowledge but the cultivation of character. Teachers, tutors, and elders were guardians of decorum, their corrections delivered with calm authority. Children learned that misbehavior, excessive noise, or impatience was not simply a personal failing, but a disruption of social harmony. Silence was taught as a virtue, a form of respect for others, and a reflection of personal refinement. In this way, the rules of the Victorian world shaped not only outward behavior, but the very inner lives of those who lived within it. Even in moments of disagreement or conflict, restraint was paramount. Disputes were conducted quietly, arguments weighed carefully, and public displays of anger were considered a mark of weakness or moral failing. To remain silent in the face of provocation was often a greater demonstration of strength than words could convey. The carefully measured life of the Victorian citizen demanded an understanding that to speak was to reveal oneself, and to remain silent was often to maintain dignity and control. Religion, too, reinforced these ideals. Prayer, meditation, and attendance at services required composure and attentiveness. Congregants were taught that silence was as expressive as speech, that the quiet reflection of the mind and the subdued tone of the voice were forms of devotion. Even in communal worship, the power of restraint and the weight of silence communicated reverence, humility, and a shared moral understanding that connected individuals within the larger social framework. In public spaces, the expectations persisted. Markets, streets, and transportation were arenas where observation and silence dictated conduct. The careful modulation of voice, the avoidance of ostentatious behavior, and the gentle acknowledgement of others' presence were hallmarks of a civilized individual. Children were reminded that their actions reflected upon their families, and adults were conscious that every movement contributed to the perception of character. Silence, in this sense, was both shield and signal, conveying propriety and attentiveness simultaneously. Even in leisure reading and writing, silence played a role. Libraries, parlors, and studies were sanctuaries of calm, where thought could proceed without interruption. The turning of pages, the scratching of quills, the soft murmur of comprehensional were gestures of disciplined engagement. The act of reading silently, of thinking deeply, and of recording observations or correspondence quietly reinforced the Victorian ideal that inner refinement was inseparable from outward conduct. Music and performance, when allowed, followed these codes as well. Private concerts or parlor performances were conducted with attention to subtlety. Even applause, a mark of appreciation, was restrained, measured, and often muted. The aesthetic of control permeated all forms of expression, emphasizing that beauty and pleasure need not contradict discipline and propriety. Silence, in these moments, framed and highlighted the performance, giving weight to every note and gesture. As the day drew to a close, households settled into evening routines that mirrored the morning. Candles were lit with care, conversations softened, and the family prepared for rest with the same attentiveness that had guided their waking hours. Silence, once again, became a conduit for reflection, a quiet acknowledgement of the world's order, and a preparation for the next day's performance within society's intricate stage. Thus, in a Victorian world where every gesture carried meaning, silence itself became a language. It communicated respect, intelligence, moral discipline, and social awareness. To master silence was to navigate life with subtlety and sophistication, to participate fully in the social order while revealing only as much as was appropriate. In this way, the very absence of sound became a presence of understanding, shaping lives, relationships, and the rhythm of daily existence in ways that continue to fascinate us today. The quiet weight of rules that shaped everyday Victorian life. In Victorian society, the smallest actions were never trivial. Each gesture, each word, even the way one held a teacup, carried weight. The rules were invisible, yet their presence was felt in every corner of daily life, guiding behavior with quiet insistence. Children learned early that these rules were not mere suggestions, but expectations that, if ignored, could subtly but permanently affect one's standing in the community. The weight of these expectations was never spoken aloud, but it settled on every shoulder, quietly, like a shadow that followed one throughout the day. Morning routines in a Victorian household reflected the careful orchestration of propriety. Maids moved silently through corridors, dusting and polishing with gentle, precise motions. Breakfasts were served with measured elegance. The clinking of cutlery was subdued, conversations were sparse, and laughter was kept soft. Every act was a performance of discipline, teaching those who observed that self-control was synonymous with refinement. Even a slight hesitation or a misplaced word could disrupt the carefully maintained order of the home. Outside the home, the rules extended into every public interaction. Streets were not merely thoroughfares, they were stages where one's conduct was continuously observed. A man tipping his hat, a woman lowering her gaze while passing a neighbor. These gestures conveyed respect, self-restraint, and an understanding of one's place in society. Children, taught from infancy, absorbed these lessons through both instruction and observation, learning that each action carried meaning beyond its immediate effect. The social weight of behavior pressed gently but insistently on every individual. Schools reinforced these norms with quiet diligence. Classrooms were places where decorum was as important as academic achievement. Students were taught to sit with proper posture, speak only when appropriate, and avoid any behavior that might draw attention to themselves. Teachers often stern yet unobtrusive, corrected small infractions with subtle gestures or whispered reminders rather than loud reprimands. The cultivation of patience, attentiveness, and restraint was considered as vital as the ability to read, write, or perform arithmetic. Even within families, the weight of rules shaped relationships. Elders expected respect, not only in words, but in the subtlest movements. How one entered a room, the angle at which one greeted a relative, the careful modulation of voice when responding to a question. Siblings learned that teasing or casual speech could breach the delicate balance of propriety, and parents emphasized that maintaining composure reflected both personal character and the family's reputation. The unspoken message was clear. One's behavior was never only personal, it was a reflection of the household, the community, and, ultimately, society itself. Leisure was no exception. Walks in the garden, visits to friends, and outings to markets or theaters were governed by the same quiet rules. Conversation remained measured. Steps were deliberate. Laughter was gentle. Even in moments of enjoyment, one was expected to maintain composure, to observe the subtle social boundaries that defined acceptable conduct. The freedom to express oneself openly was limited, replaced by a continuous awareness that every action was scrutinized, consciously or unconsciously, by those around. Letters, a vital form of communication, were carefully composed to reflect these expectations. Every greeting, every signature, every line of text was meticulously chosen to convey respect, humility, and propriety. Omissions were intentional. Pauses and phrasing were laden with meaning. In correspondence, as in life, silence itself carried significance. A careful reader could discern social nuance and judgment, not only in what was written, but in what was left unspoken. The power of restraint was evident even across distances. In the domestic sphere, even ordinary chores adhered to the unyielding weight of rules. Laundry was folded with precise edges, dishes stacked neatly, and floors swept in a steady rhythm that left no mark. Each movement was both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the idea that personal discipline contributed to a well-ordered life. The attention given to these small, quiet tasks reflected a belief that virtue could be cultivated through consistent, mindful action, and that respectability was maintained in the details. Interactions with servants, tenants, or tradespeople were similarly structured. A merchant's bow, a maid's curt reply, a butler's measured steppage conveyed the social hierarchy and expectations of propriety. Breaches, whether in tone, gesture, or timing, could create subtle tensions, remembered long after the encounter ended. The rules operated both to facilitate smooth relations and to reinforce the social order, embedding themselves so deeply into daily practice that their presence was almost invisible. Even in courtship and romance, these invisible rules held sway. Private meetings were rare. Public interactions required discretion. Young couples exchanged glances and carefully modulated words, aware that any sign of impropriety could attract gossip or disapproval. The balance of desire and restraint was delicate. Affection was expressed through subtle gestures rather than overt declarations, ensuring that both participants adhered to social expectations while navigating the emotions of the heart. Silence, patience, and observation were essential tools of courtship, shaping relationships as profoundly as personality or attraction. Religious and moral instruction reinforced this quiet weight. Sermons emphasized discipline, humility, and attention to detail. Worship itself was conducted in a manner that highlighted composure and restraint, silent prayer, orderly seating, and controlled expressions of devotion. These lessons extended beyond the church, influencing behavior at home, in public, and within the family. Morality and propriety were intertwined, and those who mastered self-restraint were regarded as exemplary citizens. Even leisure reading followed similar patterns. Books were chosen carefully, with an eye toward moral education and refinement. Stories of scandal or impropriety were avoided, while texts that illustrated virtue, patience, and industry were encouraged. Reading itself was often a silent activity, conducted in private or in subdued company, emphasizing contemplation and reflection over entertainment. Knowledge was valued, but only insofar as it reinforced the discipline and composure demanded by society. The quiet weight of these rules created a pervasive awareness of observation. Every individual understood that others were constantly noticing gestures, tone, and posture. The mere act of walking down a street, entering a room, or engaging in conversation was fraught with expectations. Social mistakes were rarely punished overtly, but the subtle consequences, raised eyebrows, whispered comments, or shifts in attention served as constant reminders of the importance of propriety. Even play and recreation were carefully moderated. Children were taught games that encouraged patience, order, and turns. Sports were often conducted with rules that emphasized fair play, etiquette, and self-control over competition. The message was consistent. Behavior, even in leisure, mattered. The cultivation of restraint and the careful exercise of judgment were as vital as the enjoyment of the activity itself. Food and dining carried similar significance. Meals were structured events where table manners, conversation, and the sequence of dishes followed strict conventions. Eating too quickly, speaking out of turn, or showing overt enthusiasm could disrupt the harmony of the table. Meals were not merely nourishment. They were exercises in discipline, social awareness, and the reinforcement of family and societal expectations. In public transport, etiquette dictated the arrangement of space and behavior. Boarding, seating, and interactions with fellow passengers followed unspoken codes. To speak too loudly, to occupy space aggressively, or to ignore decorum was to signal a lack of refinement. Even brief journeys became lessons in self-restraint and observation, further embedding the invisible rules that structured daily life. Art, music, and theater were experienced with the same attentiveness to propriety. Performances were observed quietly, applause was measured, and criticism, if expressed, was gentle and restrained. Cultural engagement was less about emotional indulgence than about demonstrating taste, discipline, and social awareness. Every action in these spaces reinforced the intricate web of expectations that governed Victorian life. As evening fell, households transitioned into quieter routines, reflecting on the day's adherence to social norms. Candles were lit methodically, rooms were arranged with care, and conversations softened to whispers. Reflection on conduct, consideration of others, and the silent rehearsal of tomorrow's interactions became habitual. The unspoken rules had shaped the day, subtly guiding every thought and action, ensuring that life was lived in a rhythm of restraint and awareness. Through all these details, one realizes that Victorian society was not merely restrictive, but profoundly structured. The quiet weight of rules touched every aspect of life, from the most intimate family moments to public encounters, from the education of children to leisure and worship. To live within this world was to carry an invisible framework of expectations, one that disciplined, guided, and shaped individuals continuously, often without their conscious acknowledgement. And so, in this era, the ordinary became extraordinary through the lens of restraint, observation, and careful adherence to invisible rules. Walking through streets where behavior was watched but rarely spoken about. In Victorian towns, walking down the street was never a careless act. The streets were not loud places of chaos, but quiet pathways where eyes were always watching and judgments were quietly formed. People understood that their posture, their pace, and even the direction of their gaze communicated something about who they were. No one needed to shout instructions or corrections. The rules of behavior were felt, not spoken, resting in the air like a soft fog that wrapped itself around every passerby. The day often began with a slow, measured rhythm. Footsteps tapped gently against cobblestone roads, not rushed but deliberate. Men adjusted their coats and hats with subtle movements, careful not to appear hurried or clumsy. Women moved with a steady grace, lifting their skirts just enough to walk properly without drawing attention to themselves. Children, walking beside their parents, learned quickly that even their small movements were being observed, and that quiet obedience was safer than playful noise in public spaces. Shops that lined the streets were quiet observers as well. Store owners did not call out loudly to attract attention. Instead, they stood calmly behind their counters, offering small nods and polite glances. A customer was expected to enter with restraint, to speak in measured tones, and to handle items with care. A careless touch or an impatient sigh could be noticed, not with confrontation, but with a subtle shift in mood that made the mistake unforgettable to the one who caused it. Street corners held their own kind of silent discipline. Neighbors passed one another with careful acknowledgement. A small bow of the head, a slight lowering of the eyes, or a brief pause in movement was enough to communicate respect. Gossip existed, but it lived mostly in expressions, not in words. People learned to read the street as one reads a book, understanding meaning through posture, silence, and the small language of glances. Carriages added another layer of quiet observation. When a horse-drawn carriage passed, pedestrians stepped aside smoothly, never in a rush. Those who rode inside sat upright, avoiding casual slouching that might suggest poor upbringing. Even the act of entering or exiting a carriage was done with care, as if the street itself were a room that demanded good manners. Children felt the pressure of watching eyes more strongly than anyone. Play was something that happened indoors or in controlled spaces. On public streets, their energy was folded inward. Boys kept their hands at their sides, and girls matched their steps to their mothers. They learned that the street was a classroom without walls, where every mistake could become a lesson remembered. Long after the walk was over, the homes that lined the street seemed to participate in this silent system. Curtains hung like soft barriers between private life and public view. Windows reflected both the outside world and the inner world, blending them into a single surface of awareness. People were mindful that even inside their own homes, they might still be visible in small ways, and their movements near windows were tempered by that thought. Weather did not break these habits. Rain made streets shinier, and steps more careful, but not chaotic. Umbrellas were carried neatly, coats were buttoned properly, and no one allowed discomfort to show openly. Snow demanded slow footsteps and controlled balance. A slip or a stumble was a private embarrassment, quietly noted by those who saw, and carefully remembered by the one who experienced it. Public spaces such as small gardens or shared courtyards, demanded the same discipline. Benches were used with restraint. People sat without sprawling, hands placed thoughtfully, backs kept straight. Conversations, when they occurred, were low and brief. A voice raised too high would feel out of place, like a disturbance in the carefully maintained stillness of the environment. Markets were slightly livelier, yet still restrained. Sellers spoke in calm tones. Buyers responded politely, and transactions happened without display. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures. Everyone seemed to understand that buying bread or vegetables was not merely an exchange of goods, but a small performance of character. Even walking alone carried meaning. A solitary figure moving down the street was expected to appear purposeful, never wandering without reason. Hands were kept steady, eyes looked forward instead of roaming. To hesitate too much was to appear uncertain or weak in character, and so people practiced moving as if every step had been carefully considered before it was taken. As daylight softened, the streets grew quieter, but not careless. Gas lamps flickered to life slowly, casting long shadows that made movements even more noticeable. Footsteps became softer, voices faded. People became even more aware that in the quiet of evening, even the smallest sound or gesture could feel larger than intended. There was a strange comfort in this silent watching. The rules were heavy, but they were familiar. Everyone knew what was expected, even if it was never explained. The quiet judgment of the street created a world where behavior felt safe, structured, and predictable. For many, this invisible framework offered a sense of belonging, as long as they moved in harmony with it. And so the Victorian street was not just a road, but a mirror. It reflected back every movement, every choice, every silent decision. Though mouths remained closed, the air was always full of meaning. The watching eyes were not cruel, but constant, shaping lives without ever raising their voices. Yet beyond these streets, behind closed doors, and inside quiet rooms, there were deeper rules still waiting to be uncovered. Rules that shaped not only how people walked, but how they sat, how they spoke, and how they lived within the walls of their own homes. How families learned to sit still, speak softly, and never overstay their words. In Victorian households, the home was not a place of loud comfort, but a quiet classroom of manners. From early childhood, family members were taught that stillness was a form of respect, that softness in speech showed good breeding, and that too many words could be seen as a lack of discipline. These lessons were rarely shouted. They were whispered through example, through repetition, and through the gentle correction of a raised eyebrow or a pause in response. The act of sitting itself was practiced. Chairs were not places to collapse into after a long day, but objects that required grace. Children learned to sit upright, hands folded neatly in their laps, feet placed carefully on the floor. A restless child was not scolded loudly, but silently guided back into proper posture. Over time, this restraint became natural, almost automatic, woven into the body as much as into the mind. Speaking was approached with equal caution. Words were chosen slowly, and sentences were often shorter than thoughts. It was considered better to be quiet than to risk saying something foolish or unnecessary. Families believed that true intelligence was shown not by how much one could say, but by how much one could leave unsaid. Voices rarely rose above a soft, balanced tone, even in moments of excitement or disagreement. Meal times offered daily practice in these habits. Long wooden tables, polished to a dull shine, reflected the careful movements of hands and utensils. Plates were passed without sound. Cutlery was lifted and placed back down with deliberate gentleness. Conversation, when it occurred, was spaced with long pauses. Children learned that eating quickly or speaking with a full mouth was not merely rude, but a sign of moral carelessness. In the evenings, families gathered in sitting rooms that were specifically designed to encourage calm. Furniture was arranged in ways that discouraged slouching or sprawling. Lamps cast a soft glow, favoring shadow over brightness. The air was often quiet enough to hear the faint ticking of a clock or the soft movement of fabric. These were not silent moments born of emptiness, but silence shaped by intention. Parents served as living examples rather than strict enforcers. A father's steady posture, a mother's composed tone, and the slow rhythm of their daily routines taught more than any spoken lecture. Children noticed these details instinctively, copying the way adults crossed their legs, placed their hands, or controlled their expressions. Manners were not taught as rules, but absorbed as a lifestyle. Visitors brought a deeper level of awareness. When guests entered the home, the entire household seemed to soften. Movements slowed. Voices dropped. Children were expected to remain visible, but silent. Present, but unobtrusive. A child who could sit quietly through a long visit was praised more highly than one who spoke cleverly. Stillness was seen as a virtue in itself. Overstaying one's welcome was considered one of the great social failures. Families carefully observed the invisible clock of politeness. Visits were short, measured, and ended before fatigue or annoyance could appear. Even affection had its boundaries. Warmth was expressed through small gestures, a soft smile, a slightly longer pause before saying goodbye. Too much closeness, too much speech, too much time was viewed as a crossing of invisible lines. Letters between family members followed the same philosophy. Words were thoughtful but restrained. Long emotional expressions were rare. Instead, meaning was hidden in subtle phrasing and timing. Even love, concern, and longing were expressed carefully, as if too much honesty might disturb the balance of propriety that held the family together. Silence, once again, became the safest form of communication. The art of listening was valued more than the art of speaking. Children were taught to wait until addressed before offering opinions. Elders spoke slowly, expecting full attention. Interruptions were gently discouraged. A household conversation was less like a lively debate and more like a slow, respectful exchange of carefully measured sentences, drifting gently through the room. Daily routines reinforced these lessons. Mornings began quietly. Shoes were placed neatly. Doors were closed gently. The sound of the household moving through the day was more like a soft hum than a series of sharp noises. Even tasks such as sewing, polishing, reading, or writing were done with an almost ceremonial calm, as though each movement held its own kind of dignity. Emotions were managed with the same discipline. Happiness was shown in small ways. Sadness was held privately. Anger, if it appeared, was quickly folded back into silence. Families believed that emotional control was a sign of inner strength. To cry loudly or laugh uncontrollably was not simply embarrassing, but a sign of weak character. Feelings were not denied, but carefully wrapped and stored away. The physical closeness of family members was also governed by invisible rules. Sitting too near, touching too often, or leaning too casually was avoided. Affection was expressed subtly, through a glance, a soft word, or a thoughtful gesture. Love existed, but it moved quietly through the household, like a breeze rather than a storm. Children grew into adults who carried these habits effortlessly. What began as instruction became instinct. The body learned to remain calm, the voice learned softness, and the mind learned restraint. By adulthood, most people no longer thought about these rules. They lived them without effort, shaped by years of silent training within the walls of their family home. In times of tension or disagreement, the tone rarely changed. Arguments were softened into polite exchanges. Strong emotions were wrapped in formal language. Silence was often used as a way of avoiding conflict rather than raising voices. Families allowed quiet gaps to appear, trusting that composure was more important than winning an argument. As the day ended, households returned once more to stillness. Curtains were drawn, lamps were lowered, chairs were straightened. Words became fewer. The home settled into a resting posture, as if it too had learned to sit still and breathe softly. These moments were not empty. They were filled with a quiet understanding that peace was maintained not through noise, but through restraint. And yet, beneath this surface of calm, there were unspoken pressures. The effort to remain composed, to be soft, to hold back words, slowly shaped the inner lives of those who lived this way. The next layer of their world waited quietly to be explored, hidden beneath the gentle discipline of family life. The slow art of dressing properly, even when no one was watching. In Victorian life, dressing was not a hurried act. It was a quiet ritual, practiced slowly and carefully, as though each layer of clothing carried not only fabric, but expectation. Even when there were no visitors expected and no public appearances planned, men and women believed that the way they dressed reflected the state of their character. To dress properly was not for others alone. It was a private discipline, observed even in solitude. The morning often began with light filtering through lace curtains, and the faint sound of a clock counting steady seconds. In that calm space, clothing was not pulled on quickly, but laid out with thought. Shirts were smoothed flat. Buttons were aligned with care. Shoes were placed side by side as if already respecting the floor they rested upon. The act of preparation felt almost sacred, as though one were preparing not just a body, but a reputation. Men's morning routines reflected restraint and order. A clean shirt was fastened slowly, cuff by cuff, button by button. Waistcoats were adjusted so that no wrinkle betrayed carelessness. Ties were tied with practiced movements, each fold learned through repetition. Even when a man remained at home that day, he would dress as though he might at any moment step into public view. The habit of dignity was too deeply woven to be abandoned in privacy. Women approached dressing with equal care, though the process was often slower and more complex. Layers of garments were added gradually, each one serving a purpose beyond comfort. Corsets were tightened to achieve the correct posture, not simply to shape the body. Skirts were arranged to fall in smooth, respectable lines. Hair was brushed, braided, and pinned not for show, but as a quiet acknowledgement of self-respect. Children, observing these rituals, absorbed the meaning without instruction. They learned that clothing was not merely protection against the cold, but a language that spoke before words were ever spoken. A neat collar suggested obedience. Polished shoes suggested care. A well-fitted jacket suggested discipline. These silent lessons shaped how children understood both themselves and the world watching them. The careful act of dressing extended even to garments that no stranger would ever see. Undergarments were folded neatly. Nightclothes were hung with care. Stockings were washed and dried properly, even though no guest would inspect them. The belief was simple but knowing. If one became careless in private, carelessness would one day show itself in public. Respectability was trained in solitude long before it was tested in society. Mirrors were not used for vanity, but for inspection. One did not study oneself for beauty, but for correctness. A crooked collar, an uneven cuff, or a loose button was not an aesthetic flaw, but a moral one. Standing before the mirror was like standing before a quiet judge, where one's attention to detail was measured in silence. Even the act of choosing clothing involved slow judgment. Colors were selected to be modest. Fabrics were chosen for durability rather than display. Excessive decoration was avoided in daily wear. Clothing was expected to suggest stability, reliability, and emotional control. Fashion, while present, was secondary to the deeper aim of communicating respect through restraint. Dressing was also shaped by the seasons. In winter, coats were brushed clean before being worn. Gloves were placed carefully, not stuffed into pockets. Hats were dusted gently. In summer, lighter fabrics were smoothed carefully to avoid creases. Every adjustment was deliberate. Every preparation intentional. The body was treated as a guest that deserved careful attention. Even illness did not excuse disorder. A person confined to bed often dressed as neatly as possible before receiving visitors. Nightwear was straightened, hair was brushed, and hands were cleaned. To appear disheveled, even in weakness, was seen as surrendering to chaos. Dignity was maintained not because it was easy, but because it was essential. There was a quiet loneliness in these rituals. Dressing alone meant standing quietly with one's thoughts, adjusting buttons while memories passed silently. Fabric brushed against skin, while the mind wandered through worries, hopes, and small private fears. And yet, even in this solitude, the movements remained careful. Solitude did not excuse sloppiness. Solitude demanded discipline. The sound of clothing itself became a familiar comfort. The soft rustle of fabric, the tiny click of buttons, the muted tap of shoes on the floor were sounds of stability. These sounds filled the quiet rooms, creating a rhythm that grounded the day before it truly began. To dress slowly was to ease the mind into order. Families shared an unspoken respect for this process. A closed bedroom door during dressing was honored. No one interrupted without reason. To rush another in their preparations was considered impolite. Each person was granted this time to align themselves with the expectations of the world, even if that world began and ended within the walls of their own home. Children, learning through watching, began to mimic these slow movements. They practiced buttoning their small coats, tying their shoes, and smoothing their hair. Mistakes were corrected gently. Rushing was discouraged. The goal was not speed, but care. A well-dressed child was seen as a reflection of a well-governed home. As years passed, these habits became instinct. Hands learned the shape of buttons without thought. Fingers knew how much pressure to use when tightening a shoe or folding a collar. The body learned, in quiet moments of solitude, how to perform dignity before an audience was ever present. Self-respect was practiced in silence. By the time a Victorian individual was ready to leave the house, the world had not yet seen them. And yet, they had already performed their most important ritual. They had proven, to themselves alone, that they could be measured, collected, and controlled. This was the slow art of dressing properly in art performed not for applause, but for inner order. And still, beyond the quiet rituals of clothing, there were other small gestures that shaped the day. How people greeted each other, how they held their hands, how they entered a room. These invisible details waited quietly in the background, ready to unfold. Why simple gestures like a nod or a handshake meant everything. In the Victorian world, the smallest movements often carried the greatest meaning. A simple nod of the head or the careful offering of a hand could speak more clearly than a long conversation. Where words were guarded, and emotions were rarely displayed openly. Gestures became a quiet language that everyone understood but seldom discussed. A nod was never random. It was measured, practiced, and filled with subtle intention. A shallow nod might acknowledge a stranger. A slower, deeper nod might express respect to a superior. Among equals, the nod was balanced, neither too long nor too short, as though the head itself had learned the proper rhythm of politeness. This movement was performed not for attention, but for harmony. Handshakes, too, were wrapped in silent rules. The hand was extended not too quickly and not too forcefully. A grip that was too tight suggested aggression. A grip that was too soft suggested weakness. Men learned to offer their hands in a way that suggested steadiness, control, and reliability. Even in business dealings, the handshake was less about sealing an agreement and more about revealing character. Children learned these gestures long before they understood their full meaning. They practiced nodding to elders, lowering their eyes slightly as a sign of modest respect. They watched their fathers and uncles exchange handshakes and noticed how the hands moved slowly, how the eyes remained calm, and how no unnecessary words were spoken during the act. The gestures felt important, even when their purpose remained unspoken. For women, gestures were wrapped in even greater subtlety. A slight lowering of the eyes, a careful tilt of the head, or a controlled movement of the hand could signal politeness without inviting familiarity. Physical contact was limited, so small movements became even more significant. A lady's nod was softer, her movements slower, and her meaning often understood only within the silent code of society. A handshake was rarely rushed. It was framed by a pause before and after, creating a small space of respect between the two people. This pause mattered. It allowed both individuals to prepare their expression, their posture, and their spirit. The moment became almost ceremonial, even in ordinary situations, because it represented trust exchanged silently. In crowded streets or narrow hallways, gestures helped people pass one another without chaos. A slight bow of the head replaced spoken apologies. A gentle turn of the body allowed someone to pass without disturbance. There was an invisible choreography at work, guiding strangers to move together without conflict. Nobody announced these rules. They were simply felt and repeated across generations. Eyes carried meaning as well. A raised gaze could invite conversation, while a lowered gaze could refuse it politely. A brief meeting of eyes could signal recognition without obligation. These were small signals, but in a world shaped by restraint, they meant everything. They allowed individuals to communicate emotion in a way that felt safe from judgment. Silence often accompanied these gestures, and in that silence, meaning grew stronger. A handshake carried the quiet hope of mutual understanding. A nod carried the acknowledgement of shared presence. Even removing one's hat or slightly adjusting posture became an act of respect. No applause followed these actions. No one praised them, and yet society depended on them completely. There were moments when the absence of a gesture was louder than any sound. A person who failed to nod could be seen as cold. A hand that stayed at one side instead of offering a greeting suggested distance or disapproval. These silent omissions could be remembered for years, carried like small wounds within the memory of polite society. Letters and formal invitations often ended with the promise of a gesture yet to come. One might write of paying respects or offering regards, knowing that these phrases would one day be translated into a carefully timed nod or a measured handshake. The future itself was filled with planned gestures that would occur quietly, without spectacle, Even grief and sorrow were expressed through small movements, a gentle placing of a hand on a shoulder, a slow lowering of the head at a funeral, or the careful taking of another's hand conveyed sympathy more deeply than words could. Excessive emotion was discouraged. Calm gestures allowed grief to exist without disrupting order at home. Families practiced these movements as naturally as breathing. Parents corrected a child's clumsy handshake. Mothers guided a daughter's posture with a soft touch. Fathers demonstrated how to remove a hat respectfully. These lessons were given not with urgency, but with patience, so that the movements would grow into the body and remain for life. Over time, these gestures became habits of the soul. People nodded without thinking, not out of fear, but out of quiet alignment with the expectations that surrounded them. They extended their hands, not for tradition alone, but to briefly share a moment of balance with another human being. And yet, beneath the calm of these movements, there were feelings that rarely found words: respect, hesitation, curiosity, and even fear moved through the tiniest gestures. The body spoke what the voice was trained to hide. In this way, simple gestures became small windows into the private, silent lives of those who lived so carefully. As the day moved forward and new encounters awaited, these unseen rules followed each person like a gentle shadow. Beyond nods and handshakes, other silent signals shaped conversations yet to happen, waiting quietly in the background, ready to guide the next exchange. Tea rooms that felt like libraries of human behavior. Tea rooms in the Victorian world were quiet places, but not empty ones. They were filled with soft movement, careful breathing, and the gentle sound of porcelain touching polished wood. These rooms did not exist simply for drinking tea. They existed as small, enclosed worlds where behavior was studied silently. Like pages in a book no one ever spoke about aloud. The air in a tea room held a special kind of calm. Curtains filtered the harshness of sunlight, and the ticking of a clock often became the loudest sound in the space. Chairs were pulled back slowly. Footsteps were soft by thick carpets. Voices hovered just above silence, never rising high enough to disturb the careful order of the room. Each person who entered seemed to understand they were stepping into a place of quiet observation. A gentleman removed his gloves in a practiced manner. A lady adjusted her shawl without haste. Even the turning of a teaspoon inside a cup followed an unspoken rhythm, never clinking too loudly, never breaking the peaceful balance that everyone worked to preserve. In these tea rooms, people learned by watching. They observed how long others paused before sipping their tea. They noticed where eyes were allowed to rest and where they should not linger. They memorized the angle of a polite smile and the proper moment to lower their gaze. Very little was corrected directly. Learning happened through quiet imitation. The tables became small stages for restrained emotion. Letters were read slowly, folded carefully, and tucked away without display. News was shared in soft fragments rather than excited bursts. Even laughter, when it happened, was controlled and brief, like a ripple that vanished before it could become a wave. Tea itself was part of the lesson. The cup was lifted with care, held close but never rushed. Steam rose gently, and the smell of warm leaves gave the room a sense of comfort. Sugar was added without spectacle. Milk was poured slowly. Everything happened at a pace that seemed designed to slow the heart and quiet the mind. The servers who worked in these rooms understood their role well. They walked lightly, placing cups and saucers with silent accuracy. They avoided interrupting conversations or drawing attention to themselves. Their presence was felt through smooth efficiency rather than words, as though they were part of the room's architecture rather than separate from it. Children, when allowed inside, became instantly still. They sensed that this was not a place for sudden movement. Small hands were folded in laps. Feet were kept close to chairs. Their eyes grew wide as they absorbed the quiet tension of the space. The tea room was not frightening, but it carried a weight of expectation that even young minds could feel. Tea rooms also worked as safe spaces for solitude. A person could sit alone at a small table and feel no pressure to perform. Silence was not awkward here. It was welcomed. Thoughts were allowed to stretch out slowly, like long shadows in the afternoon light. Many people found peace in these rooms, simply by being present. What made tea rooms feel like libraries of human behavior was the way everything felt catalogued. Every movement, every pause, every expression seemed filed away in memory. Regular visitors learned the invisible rules by returning again and again, watching how familiar faces moved through their rituals of quiet politeness. Meetings in these rooms were never rushed. Conversations unfolded slowly, with long pauses between sentences. These pauses were not empty. They were filled with careful thought. Speaking too quickly felt improper. Words were selected with patience, as though each one had weight and should not be placed carelessly into the air outside. Streets were loud with horses, carts, and voices, but inside the tea room, the world softened. Windows worked like gentle barriers, holding back chaos while allowing in light. The tea room became a refuge from life's roughness, a place where order could be felt in the most delicate of ways. Over time, people came to treat these spaces with something close to reverence. It was not because of luxury, but because of predictability. One could enter and know exactly how the room would feel. That certainty brought comfort. It made the world feel manageable, even when everything beyond the door felt uncertain. Some came to tea rooms not only for tea, but to feel understood without being spoken to. They found companionship in quiet glances and familiar silence. Even without names being exchanged, a shared understanding formed through posture, rhythm, and restraint. The rituals of the tea room seeped into private life as well. At home, people tried to recreate the same quiet grace. They stirred their cups slowly, placed their spoons carefully, and spoke in lowered tones, remembering the calm that existed within those carefully arranged walls. Yet, beneath the calm surface, thoughts moved freely. Dreams, worries, and hidden longings existed quietly behind composed faces. The tea room did not eliminate emotion. It simply gave it a quieter place to live. And as time moved forward, these calm rooms continued to exist quietly in the background of daily life, shaping how people would one day behave in other spaces where silence would again become a form of learning. Children learning the language of obedience before they learned to play in the Victorian world. Childhood was not a time that began with freedom. It began with stillness. Long before children were taught how to run, climb, or shout, they were taught how to be quiet. Obedience was not introduced as a rule. It was given as a habit, slowly folded into the corners of everyday life. From their earliest days, children learned that the world around them worked best when they took up as little space as possible. Small hands were expected to rest calmly in laps. Feet were taught to remain still beneath chairs. Even breathing was corrected gently, as though silence could be learned through the body itself. Nurseries were not loud places filled with constant laughter. Instead, they carried a soft hush, broken only by the low steps of a caretaker or the slow creak of a wooden floorboard. Toys existed, but they were simple and rarely used for wild movement. A doll might be held rather than thrown. A wooden block might be stacked quietly, then carefully taken apart. Parents believed that character was formed in silence. A child who waited patiently was praised more than a child who spoke loudly. Words like proper and calm floated gently through the air. Discipline was not always harsh. Often, it was quiet. A look, a pause, or a gentle touch on the shoulder was enough to remind a child where they belonged. Lessons came before games. A young child might spend long stretches of time watching adults move through their daily routines. They observed how cups were lifted, how doors were opened without sound, and how voices remained soft even during disagreement. Childhood became a long process of watching and absorbing rather than experimenting and exploring. Even mealtimes were part of this education. Children were expected to sit upright, to chew slowly, and to remain silent unless spoken to. A fallen spoon was picked up without drama. A spill was met with quiet correction rather than chaos. The table was not a place of excitement. It was another classroom where control was practiced. Religious instruction often deepened these habits. Stillness was tied to virtue. Quiet was linked to goodness. Children were told, gently and repeatedly, that a calm spirit showed a clean heart. This idea sank deep into their thoughts, shaping how they moved through the world and how they judged themselves when noise or excitement escaped their careful control. In many homes, play happened indoors and in small doses. Running was saved for rare moments outdoors, and even then, it was often supervised. Loud laughter was corrected softly, but firmly. A child quickly learned to swallow sudden excitement, to replace it with a small smile or a careful glance. There were moments, however, when this quiet training felt heavy. Some children would stare out of tall windows, watching birds in the garden or leaves moving freely in the wind. Their hands would twitch slightly, wanting to follow that movement. But even then, obedience often held them still, anchored to the expectations that surrounded them. Fathers expected their sons to grow into controlled men. Mothers hoped their daughters would become calm, graceful women. These expectations were not shouted. They were whispered through repetition, woven into bedtime routines and morning prayers. Over time, the idea of obedience stopped feeling like something taught. It began to feel natural, like breathing. In schools, the pattern continued. Classrooms were arranged in straight lines. Desks were clean and carefully spaced. Children were not encouraged to speak unless invited. Even curiosity had to pass through the slow filter of respect. A raised hand meant patience. Waiting was considered a virtue stronger than desire or excitement. At night, bedtime was not chaotic or playful. It was slow and predictable. Clothing was folded neatly. Hair was brushed gently. Prayers were murmured. Even dreams seemed expected to be calm. The world of a child was enclosed within soft routines that rarely allowed sudden movement or noise. Tears were handled quietly. A crying child was comforted, but also taught not to draw attention. Emotions were permitted, but only in small, controlled portions. A child learned to swallow frustration and sit with it silently. Comfort was given without encouraging display. Outside, other children lived under the same quiet laws. Gardens were walked through softly. Schoolyards were calmer than one might expect. Even when children gathered, there was a shared understanding that too much movement, too much noise, or too much laughter could be seen as improper. Despite all this, small sparks of mischief still lived quietly inside young hearts. A hidden smile exchanged. Across a room, a quiet giggle pressed into a sleeve. A slow tapping of fingers against wood when no one was watching. these tiny rebellions were not loud, but they were real. The language of obedience shaped not only behavior, but thought. Children began to believe that value was found in control, that goodness lived in stillness, and that safety existed in silence. By the time they were ready to truly play, many had already learned to measure themselves by how little trouble they caused. And as these children grew older, the quiet lessons remained with them, guiding how they would later listen, speak, move, and exist in a world where play would always come second to order, and emotion would continue to find its place quietly, waiting for the next unspoken rule to appear. How women balanced grace, silence, and invisible expectations in the Victorian world. A woman's life was shaped by rules that were rarely written down but always felt. Grace was not something she could choose or ignore. It was something she was expected to carry in her posture, her voice, and even in her silence. These expectations lived quietly around her, like soft walls that could not be seen but were always present. From a young age, girls were taught that gentle movement was a virtue. Their steps were trained to be light. Their voices were guided to remain soft. Laughter was allowed, but only in small, controlled moments. A loud voice was often mistaken for a restless spirit, and restlessness was seen as something to soften, not encourage. Clothing played a quiet role in teaching these lessons. Heavy skirts slowed walking. Tight bodices shaped posture. Gloves covered hands that might otherwise fidget. Even the simple act of sitting down required careful attention so that nothing appeared rushed or careless. These physical restraints became a natural part of daily life, quietly shaping the way women existed in space. Silence was not always emptiness. For many women, it became a form of protection. Speaking less often meant revealing less. It allowed thoughts and feelings to remain safely hidden behind a composed face. In a world that valued female modesty above honesty, silence became a skill, practiced with care and patience. Conversations were guided by invisible boundaries. Certain topics were safe, and others were never touched. A woman learned to listen more than she spoke, to nod in understanding, and to respond with softness rather than certainty. Even when she held strong opinions, they were folded carefully into neutral words or kept hidden entirely. At home, the responsibility of calm often rested on her shoulders. She was expected to maintain peace in the rooms she moved through. The arrangement of furniture, the tone of conversation, the smoothness of daily routine, all reflected her unseen labor. She created order quietly, without expecting recognition, as though harmony were simply her natural gift rather than her effort. In social gatherings, her presence was meant to be noticeable, but never disruptive. She had to appear attentive without appearing curious, friendly without appearing familiar, intelligent without appearing ambitious. These balancing acts formed a quiet performance that never truly stopped, even when she was tired. Religious and moral teachings deepened these invisible expectations. Patience was praised as a feminine virtue. Endurance was quietly admired. Suffering, when done without complaint, was held as a sign of strength. In this way, inner struggles were often buried beneath polite smiles and graceful movement. Marriage brought a new layer of silence. A wife was meant to support without questioning, to adapt without resisting. Even love was expected to move quietly, without drama. A calm household reflected her success. A troubled home reflected her failure. Even when the weight of the matter was far beyond her control, there were moments when women found small freedoms within these restrictions. A private journal kept beneath folded clothes, a long pause at a window, a soft hum while tending to embroidery. These tiny spaces of solitude offered brief escape from the constant work of appearing calm and agreeable. Friendships between women often lived in glances and shared quietness. Quietness. A slight touch on the arm could say more than a paragraph of words. Tea shared in silence became a form of comfort. These relationships thrived under the same rules that limited them, finding warmth within restraint. The home itself reflected her invisible labor. Curtains were drawn just enough to soften light. Cushions were arranged carefully. Flowers were chosen not for boldness, but for harmony. Every detail was meant to create a space that felt controlled and peaceful, even if her own thoughts were anything but. Even illness was expected to be carried quietly. A headache was endured. Fatigue was soft with a gentle smile. Complaints were swallowed. To suffer without burdening others was seen as a form of dignity. Her body became another place where silence was practiced. The passage of time did not lessen these expectations. If anything, they deepened. The longer a woman lived under these rules, the more natural they felt. She no longer thought of them as restrictions, but as part of who she was. Silence became familiar. Grace became automatic. Yet beneath all this softness, there often lived a quiet strength. To carry so many expectations without open resistance required endurance that was rarely acknowledged. Women developed inner worlds rich with observation, memory, and imagination. These worlds remained mostly unseen, but they existed fully and deeply. As evening fell and lamplight softened the sharp edges of the day, women moved gently through their rooms, smoothing the world around them with quiet hands. They balanced everything expected of them with movements so polished that no one noticed the effort behind it. And still, beyond the silence they mastered and the grace they carried, more unspoken rules waited in the shadows of their world, ready to shape the next quiet chapter of daily Victorian life. Why men were trapped inside their own quiet role of strength. In the Victorian world, strength was not something men were allowed to explain. It was something they were expected to wear silently, like a heavy coat that could not be removed in public. The idea of manhood was tied not to loud courage or visible power, but to a steady, unshaken calm that allowed no visible cracks. From childhood, boys were taught that restraint was the clearest sign of maturity. A boy who did not cry was admired. A boy who did not complain was trusted. The absence of emotion was praised more than the presence of joy. In this way, silence became the first test of strength long before any true hardship had been faced. As men grew older, this quiet training turned into daily performance. They were expected to stand straight, walk with purpose, and speak only when necessary. Even in social gatherings, a man was valued not for how much he said, but for the weight of what he left unsaid. Calmness was considered more impressive than passion. Work carried its own silent expectations, whether in an office, workshop, factory, or field. A man was expected to endure physical and mental fatigue without remark. Long hours were worn as proof of character. Complaints were seen as weakness. A tired face was smoothed into neutrality before stepping into public view. The home was meant to be his refuge. But even there, the role did not disappear. A man was expected to return home, carrying authority and stability. His tone remained measured. His movements remained controlled. Children looked to him not for softness, but for structure. In many houses, his presence shaped the mood of entire rooms without him needing to raise his voice. Friendship between men was framed by distance and respect. Conversations rarely touched emotional truths. Instead, they circled around safe topics such as work, weather, and duty. Even when pain or fear lived under the surface, it remained buried beneath polite jokes and firm handshakes. Vulnerability had no official place in masculine behavior. Clothing itself reinforced this quiet strength. Stiff collars held the neck upright. Heavy layers added weight to the shoulders. Boots struck the ground with steady rhythm. A man's body was trained to appear solid, unmoved by the shifting emotions that naturally existed within the human mind. Public life offered little escape. On trains, in offices, and on walking paths, other men mirrored the same restrained behavior. Nobody asked if another was struggling. Support was offered not through words, but through shared silence. Standing beside one another without speaking became a sign of understanding stronger than speech. Illness, fear, and loss were folded inward. A grieving man was expected to remain composed. Tears were hidden behind closed doors, if allowed at all. Even joy was controlled. Laughter was short. Smiles were measured. The full range of human emotion existed, but it was always viewed through a narrow lens of acceptability. Inside this quiet strength, many men carried heavy, unseen weights. The pressure to provide, the fear of failure, the loneliness of never being fully known. Yet, because everyone around them wore the same calm mask, these feelings remained largely unspoken. Each man believed he walked alone in silence, even while surrounded by others who felt the same. Rest came rarely, and when it did, it was often functional rather than emotional. Sleep was valued because it prepared the body for more work, not because it softened the soul. Leisure was acceptable only when it did not disrupt the image of reliability. Idleness was seen as dangerous, as though stillness with thought might invite weakness. Even fatherhood was shaped by these rules. A father was expected to teach discipline more than affection. Guidance came through example rather than touch. A child learned what strength looked like by watching what was never expressed, what was never named, and what was carried silently from morning until night. There was a quiet loneliness in this expectation. While women were confined by grace and silence, men were confined by strength and silence. Both lived under walls built from unspoken rules, yet men rarely spoke to anyone about the narrowness of their emotional world, because to do so would have broken the very image they were taught to preserve. Dreams and fears existed quietly in the spaces between duty and rest. They appeared in the long walk home, the quiet stare into a fire, or the stillness of a darkened bedroom. But by morning, those thoughts were folded away, replaced once more by the practiced face of control. And so, day after day, men moved through their lives carrying a quiet identity that allowed no visible weakness. Strength became something performed, rehearsed, and repeated until it felt real, even when the heart underneath felt tired. And beyond this heavy silence, more rules continued to grow, shaping not only behavior, but even the thoughts that men were allowed to have. The hidden rules of eating, sitting, and even standing correctly in the Victorian world. Every movement of the body carried significance, even those that today might seem ordinary. Eating, sitting, and standing were not merely acts of survival or comfort. They were daily performances guided by invisible rules that taught order, discipline, and respect. Every action became a measure of character, a subtle communication of upbringing and social understanding. From the earliest moments of childhood, boys and girls alike were taught that meals were far more than the consumption of food. The teba, became a stage for propriety. Children were shown how to place their hands, how to hold utensils, and how to maintain a calm posture. To bend forward too eagerly or to chew audibly was considered improper. A child who fidgeted, tapped, or moved unnecessarily drew quiet correction, sometimes only through a disapproving glance or a gentle touch. Seating was equally chairs were pulled out with care, so that no sound disturbed the smooth rhythm of the dining room. When sitting, knees were held together, back straight, and hands either on the lap or lightly resting near the plate. Crossing one's legs incorrectly, leaning back too far, or slumping in a chair could suggest laziness or lack of self-control. These lessons were repeated daily until movement became instinct rather than conscious thought. Even the posture required while standing carried its own expectations. Men were taught to maintain a confident, upright stance, shoulders squared, weight evenly distributed. Women were guided to stand with subtle grace, their hands positioned delicately, feet softly aligned. Standing was not simply standing, it was a display of restraint, awareness, and quiet authority within social boundaries. Meals themselves were governed by silent rules as intricate as any formal ritual. Food was served in courses, each consumed with deliberate slowness. A gentleman did not reach across the table carelessly, and a lady did not serve herself hastily. The placement of utensils, the careful rotation of a spoon or fork, the measured patch of eating, all signaled careful attention to propriety. The act of consuming food became a way to demonstrate respect for both the household and for one's own self-discipline. Conversation at the table followed a similar quiet choreography. One did not speak while chewing, nor did one raise the voice to fill the room. Words were chosen carefully, and pauses were extended, allowing others to respond without interruption. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was an essential part of the rhythm, a breathing space in which observation became as important as expression. Children learned to mimic these behaviors from early observation. Even before fully understanding why, they recognized that eating properly, sitting gracefully, and standing correctly garnered approval. A boy would watch his father lift his spoon just so. A girl would notice her mother adjusting her posture mid-meal. These small lessons formed the foundation of lifelong decorum, instilling habits that would remain long after the rules were no longer explicitly taught. The arrangement of the table itself reinforced these lessons. Plates were centered precisely, glasses aligned, and napkins folded in consistent patterns. Small deviations were quietly corrected, sometimes through subtle gestures that children learned to read instinctively. The very objects around them, from cutlery to cups, became teachers of patience, order, and attentiveness. Even gestures as seemingly minor as passing a dish required careful execution. One did not thrust an item across the table. Instead, it was extended with a gentle, deliberate motion. Eye contact accompanied the movement, signaling respect and acknowledgement. The slow rhythm of passing plates and sharing utensils became a kind of silent conversation, one that spoke of harmony more effectively than any spoken word. Beyond the table, the discipline of movement extended into daily life. A man walking across a room did so with measured steps, ensuring his boots did not scuff the floor excessively. A woman entering a parlor moved lightly, each step calculated to preserve composure. Even resting one's weight too heavily on furniture could be interpreted as laziness or lack of refinement. Every gesture was an unspoken performance of character. These patterns extended into moments of leisure. In libraries, drawing rooms, or tea spaces, the same precision was expected. A gentleman adjusting his coat or straightening a cuff, a lady smoothing the folds of her skirt, a child arranging a book on a table. Each action reinforced the same invisible curriculum. Life itself became a series of rehearsals, each designed to cultivate restraint, awareness, and quiet elegance. The hidden rules were reinforced by observation, imitation, and correction. Tutors and caretakers rarely shouted instructions. Instead, they allowed children to absorb lessons through repetition and careful modeling. The absence of overt punishment encouraged subtle self-regulation. By watching those around them, children learned not only what to do, but why, even if the reasons were never fully articulated. In public spaces, these behaviors were even more pronounced. Entering a room, men and women alike adjusted posture, took small, measured steps, and spoke in carefully controlled tones. The slightest deviation, a hurried motion, an abrupt gesture could attract attention, or at least a raised eyebrow. Politeness and decorum acted as social currency, silently evaluated by peers at every opportunity. Even eating in public carried its own layer of complexity. A gentleman in a restaurant had to manage utensils correctly while maintaining a composed demeanor. A lady, accompanied by others, had to navigate the same rules with grace. Every movement, from lifting a cup to setting down a knife, was observed, even if unnoticed consciously. To eat hastily, sloppily, or with distraction was to signal inattention to both personal discipline and social expectation. At home, these rules were applied with even greater subtlety. Servants learned to anticipate needs without disturbing the household. Dishes were prepared and arranged to minimize fuss. Chairs were placed precisely. Every part of the environment reinforced the expectations that guided behavior, quietly teaching children the rhythm of life shaped by restraint. Even moments of transition carried silent expectations. Rising from the table, leaving a room, or greeting a guest involved subtle choreography. A man might straighten his coat and lift his chin. A woman might smooth her skirt and adjust her posture. Movement was never careless, for the smallest lapse could suggest distraction, fatigue, or lack of training. The lessons of posture, sitting, and eating were lifelong. As children became adults, the habits ingrained during quiet observation and patient correction formed the basis of daily existence. They moved through the world with an internalized rhythm of decorum, aware of both themselves and the silent judgment of those around them. Even in solitude, these invisible rules persisted, shaping how they breathed, gestured, and carried their bodies through space. Through it all, the Victorian emphasis on restraint created a paradoxical form of freedom. While behavior was heavily monitored and regulated, the consistency of these invisible rules provided structure, stability, and predictability. Those who mastered the quiet art of eating, sitting, and standing correctly could navigate social life with minimal friction, their self-discipline serving as a shield against chaos. And yet, beneath this careful choreography, the weight of expectation could feel heavy. Children, and later adults, bore these rules like invisible armor, balancing restraint with natural impulses. Every bite, every step, every gesture carried meaning far beyond what modern eyes might perceive. Even the most ordinary moments became measures of character, patience, and refinement. In the end, life itself was shaped by these hidden rules. Each day presented opportunities to practice, reinforce, and perform. Meals were not merely eaten, they were observed, calculated, and experienced as lessons in self-discipline, Sitting was not merely resting, it was a demonstration of poise. Standing was not merely a position, it was a declaration of internal order. These small, quiet acts became the foundation upon which Victorian life and the careful social hierarchies within it were built. Even when the day ended and the household quieted, the lessons lingered. Every chair had been adjusted, every plate carefully set, every posture silently reviewed in memory. These acts of precision were not trivial. They were the invisible framework of a society that valued control, awareness, and subtlety above all else. In learning to eat, sit, and stand correctly, individuals learned how to live in a world where every action mattered, whether noticed or not, and where the weight of decorum rested quietly upon every shoulder, hand, and foot. Calling cards, formal visits, and the slow ceremony of being social in Victorian society. Social interaction was less about conversation and more about ritual. The exchange of calling cards, the carefully arranged visits, and the slow choreography of greetings and farewells created a world in which etiquette ruled above all else. Every movement, gesture, and word was part of a performance whose rules were understood but rarely spoken aloud. To navigate this world successfully required both patience and precision. A calling card was never a simple piece of paper. It carried meaning far beyond the name printed upon it. Its size, the quality of the paper, the script, and even the placement of initials were laden with unspoken signals. One could indicate the level of intimacy, the urgency of a visit, or even a subtle warning. Receiving a card demanded quiet attention. To leave one's own card was to declare one's presence thoughtfully, never impulsively. The arrival of a visitor was itself an event. Servants were expected to announce guests with careful phrasing and timing. The lady of the house adjusted her dress, ensuring no wrinkles suggested inattentiveness. The gentleman straightened his coat and shoulders, signaling composure without overt ceremony. Each movement, however subtle, contributed to the impression that the household was harmonious, ordered, and welcoming without seeming rehearsed. Visits were slow affairs. A proper calling visit could take hours, beginning with careful walking through the streets, pacing each step to avoid jostling or uneven motion. Arriving at the door required measured composure. A firm but gentle knock, a polite pause to allow the servant to answer, and a soft, courteous greeting that balanced warmth with restraint. Any deviation from this rhythm risked social embarrassment, or at least a subtle loss of respect. Inside the home, the pace of conversation was deliberate. Words were chosen with care, and pauses were extended to allow proper reflection. Silence was a natural part of communication. A glance, a tilt of the head, or a slight nod often conveyed more meaning than spoken words. Each visitor observed the household's expectations while demonstrating their own refinement through the small gestures of polite attention. Seating arrangements followed strict conventions. Guests were guided to chairs according to status, age, and relationship. The placement of a cushion, the direction in which one turned, and the position of hands all adhered to unspoken rules that ensured social balance. Even crossing one's legs incorrectly or leaning back too far could betray a lack of understanding, disrupting the harmony carefully maintained by everyone present. Tea, when served, was another stage for subtle etiquette. Cups were held by the handle between thumb and forefinger, not too tightly, not too loosely. Spoons were moved with care, and sugar or milk was added silently and deliberately. The rhythm of pouring and sipping mirrored the rhythm of conversation, slow and deliberate, a quiet dance where every movement mattered. The act of leaving followed an equally formal ritual. Guests did not depart abruptly. Farewells were measured, with thanks expressed politely and with attention to hierarchy. A bow, a nod, or a small inclination of the head marked the conclusion of the visit. Hands were shaken or left lightly in laps, and a quiet retreat was made, ensuring the host was neither rushed nor overlooked. Even the closing of the door carried significance, signaling the end of interaction without disrupting the decorum of the household. Children, when present, absorbed these rituals from an early age. They learned to bow their heads, offer polite responses, and maintain stillness while observing adults navigate this complex web of social expectations. Playfulness was contained, as uncontrolled behavior risked interrupting the subtle performance of etiquette. In this way, the lessons of calm, precision, and respect were reinforced across generations. The formal visit created a shared understanding that extended beyond the moment. Hosts and visitors alike memorized the rhythms of interaction, learning when to speak, when to pause, and when to simply observe. These skills were vital to maintaining social harmony. Even the smallest misstep, a card placed incorrectly, a greeting uttered too quickly, could disrupt the carefully maintained order and, in some cases, subtly diminish one's social standing. Calling cards themselves were exchanged, not merely as tokens, but as promises. They indicated intentions, relationships, and awareness of social boundaries. The order in which cards were presented and received carried meaning. The absence of a card could be as telling as its presence. Social reputation, though invisible, was carefully tracked and maintained through these small, deliberate gestures. Servants played a crucial role in enforcing these social conventions. They were trained to anticipate expectations, ensuring that the proper etiquette was observed from the moment a visitor arrived until the final farewell. Every movement, from the placement of a chair to the pouring of tea, was executed with precision. Mistakes by a servant could reflect poorly on the household, making silent compliance essential to maintaining social decorum. Even minor details were considered essential. The arrangement of flowers, the alignment of furniture, the quiet placement of a footstool all contributed to an atmosphere that reinforced etiquette. Guests noticed these details subconsciously, interpreting them as signals of order, taste, and refinement. A household that maintained these small elements of decorum reflected a mastery of the slow, careful ceremony of social life. Over time, participants became fluent in the unspoken language of formal visits. They learned how to interpret gestures, understand pauses, and respond appropriately to subtle cues. Conversation became a form of chess, where each move was carefully considered, yet delivered with effortless grace. The appearance of natural ease required mastery of rigid structure behind the scenes. Even disagreements were tempered by the unspoken rules of decorum. A slight frown, a careful turn of the head, or a pause could express disapproval without disrupting the peace of the visit. Conflict, when it arose, was managed silently and subtly, preserving the social equilibrium. In this way, etiquette acted as both guidance and restraint, shaping human behavior in nearly invisible ways. Seasonal changes also influenced social routines. Summer visits demanded lighter clothing, careful navigation of steps and thresholds, and attention to outdoor decorum. Winter visits emphasized warmth and stability, with firelit parlors providing a backdrop for slow conversation. Each season brought nuances in gesture, speech, and timing, further embedding the habits of deliberate social performance. The repetition of these rituals created an internalized sense of timing and awareness. Individuals carried the lessons of formal visits into other areas of life, from church pews to promenades, reinforcing the same principles of measured interaction, silent observation, and careful expression. Sociality itself became a practice, where decorum guided the body, speech, and even thought. Even letters reflected these conventions. Written invitations and responses followed strict patterns of phrasing, spacing, and tone. A single misused phrase or improperly folded letter could be noticed and interpreted. The slow, deliberate nature of written communication mirrored the careful timing of visits, reinforcing a broader culture of precision, patience, and measured social conduct. By mastering calling cards, formal visits, and the slow ceremony of social interaction, individuals demonstrated not just education, but refinement, understanding, and an ability to navigate the subtle hierarchies of Victorian life. The lessons learned in these moments shaped behavior, judgment, and awareness, silently teaching a language of etiquette that extended far beyond the drawing room. Even after a visit concluded, the effects lingered. Observations were remembered, gestures replayed in thought, and subtle corrections noted for future encounters. Social interaction was thus a continual process of refinement, teaching participants how to exist in harmony, grace, and quiet attentiveness. In this world, the art of being social was a slow, deliberate, and deeply cultivated skill, one that required patience, attention, and lifelong practice. How letters were written like soft whispers across long distances. In the Victorian era, letters were more than messages. They were gentle extensions of the self, carefully composed and transmitted across distances that could feel immense. Every stroke of the pen, every fold of the paper, every carefully chosen word carried meaning far beyond the surface. Letters were soft whispers across time and space, connecting individuals while demanding the quiet discipline of attention and patience. Writing a letter began with the selection of materials. Stationery was never casual. The texture of the paper, the subtle color, the weight of the card or sheetal contributed to the unspoken tone of the communication. A letter was a physical object first, a sign that someone had paused, considered, and chosen to leave behind a tangible trace of thought. Ink was carefully selected, quills or pens meticulously prepared, for even the darkness of the line could imply seriousness, intimacy, or formality. The process of writing was slow and deliberate. Each word was measured, each sentence shaped with care. Abbreviations were avoided, as they suggested haste or carelessness. Proper grammar, punctuation, and spelling were not only expected, but scrutinized by both sender and recipient. The rhythm of the writing reflected the internal rhythm of the mind, soft, deliberate, and composed. A letter was not hurried. It was crafted. Phrases were chosen to convey subtle nuance. Emotions were hinted at, rather than declared. Affection was shown through gentle repetition, careful phrasing, and occasionally through small decorative flourishes in the script. Over an I, a carefully curved letter, or a flourish at the end of a signature could communicate warmth, respect, or intimacy that words alone might not capture. The act of reading a letter became a delicate dance of interpretation, each recipient attuned to the subtle cues left on the page. Letters often followed strict conventions. Openings, closings, and forms of address were selected with care. A gentleman might begin with "my esteemed friend" or "dear sir," while a lady's greeting was equally deliberate. "My dearest cousin" or "esteemed madam." These phrases, though seemingly simple, carried weight, signaling social awareness and the proper tone for the relationship. Sending the letter was equally rich. Envelopes were folded in precise manners. Wax seals were applied carefully, their impressions stamped firmly yet elegantly, serving both as closure and as a silent signature of authenticity and intention. Every crease, every fold, every mark carried a message beyond the written words, indicating patience, care, and social understanding. Delivery was slow, adding to the anticipation of the correspondence. Letters could travel miles over days or weeks, carried by mail coaches, trains, or horse riders. The distance transformed writing into a quiet meditation, as senders contemplated the passage of their words across space and time. Waiting for a response became a practice of patience, an exercise in reflection and restraint. For recipients, opening a letter was a sacred act. The rustle of paper, the soft crack of the wax seal, the careful unfolding of the chital created an experience of intimacy and connection. The letter was treated as a small treasure, to be read slowly, repeated if necessary, its subtleties savored. A careless handling, a quick glance, or a misfold could feel almost sacrilegious, diminishing the careful effort of the sender. Letters were not limited to personal matters. They conveyed instructions, news, and social obligations. Yet even these communications were infused with careful tone and measured phrasing. A business letter, though functional, still reflected decorum. A request was softened, a critique wrapped in subtle politeness. The art of letter writing demanded awareness of both content and delivery, shaping social behavior as much as communication itself. Children learned this art through observation. Young girls watched their mothers writing letters to distant relatives, noting the slow movements of the pen, the careful pauses, and the intentional spacing of words. Boys observed fathers carefully drafting instructions or invitations, learning that even practicality could carry a measure of grace. In time, children internalized the rhythm of correspondence as an essential part of polite life. Letter writing also offered private space for reflection. Thoughts, fears, and feelings could be expressed quietly, contained within the soft boundaries of paper and ink. Unlike spoken words, letters allowed the writer to measure the weight of emotion, shaping expression with patience and control. A sigh could be hinted at in phrasing. Longing could be implied in repetition. Letters were not only communication, but also rehearsal, practicing subtlety and control in a world that prized calm and measured expression. The physical arrangement of text held importance as well. Margins were carefully observed. Lines were straight, evenly spaced. The left and right edges of a page were considered boundaries within which meaning was contained. Indentation, spacing between paragraphs, and even the length of sentences contributed to clarity, tone, and the perception of care. Each element reinforced the quiet discipline valued in Victorian life. Occasionally, letters carried small decorations, flourishes of ink, hand-drawn motifs, or ornamental initials. These were never ostentatious, but subtle signals of attention and thoughtfulness. A flower in the margin could hint at affection. A curl of a letter could soften the severity of a request. Even these minor details were studied and appreciated, forming an additional layer of non-verbal communication. Responses to letters were equally mindful. Writing back required similar care, maintaining the rhythm and tone established by the sender. A mismatch in style could signal disrespect or inattentiveness. Thus, correspondence became a delicate dialogue of form, content, and gesture. Over time, these exchanges trained participants to recognize subtle cues, to understand intention, and to respond with consideration. Letters also bridged distance in emotional terms. Families separated by miles, lovers parted by circumstance, and friends divided by obligations found a quiet intimacy through the written word. The slow arrival of a letter transformed ordinary messages into precious connections. Even when the content was simple news of weather, health, or root in the act of writing and receiving, reinforced bonds in a way speech alone could not. Over years, letter writing shaped personality and social expectation. Patience, precision, attentiveness, and awareness became ingrained habits. Writers developed careful observation of human behavior, learning to anticipate how words would be received, how gestures were perceived, and how silence could carry meaning. The practice of correspondence became a form of social education as much as a means of connection. Even in solitude, letters taught discipline. Composing a page required focus, reflection, and self-control. The anticipation of a response encouraged empathy, as one considered the thoughts and feelings of the reader. In this way, the art of letter writing was a subtle training in patience, observation, and the unspoken rules of polite society. And so, letters moved quietly through Victorian life, soft whispers traveling across distances, shaping behavior, refining expression, and sustaining connection. Each envelope, each stroke of ink, and each carefully folded page became a testament to the value placed on restraint, precision, and subtle communication. In learning to write, send, and receive letters, people learned not only the language of words, but the language of careful, thoughtful living. A language that spoke volumes, even when it was whispered across miles of paper and ink. Living in homes where even footsteps were meant to be gentle. In the Victorian era, homes were not just buildings. They were carefully orchestrated stages for daily life. Spaces in which silence, restraint, and subtlety governed movement. Even the softest noise could be noticed, interpreted, and, at times, judged. A simple footstep, if too heavy or abrupt, could suggest carelessness, impatience, or lack of refinement. Children learned this lesson early. The floor was not merely a surface to walk upon, but a medium in which propriety was enacted and tested. Halls were long, polished, and echoing, often lined with rugs, runners, or carpets meant to muffle sound and guide movement. Walking across a room was a deliberate act. One placed each foot with attention, maintaining balance, poise, and control. Even the rhythm of movement mattered. A hurried step could disrupt the invisible harmony of the home, while a well-measured gait communicated calm, respect, and awareness of the environment. In larger houses, multiple levels increased the complexity of movement. Staircases required particular attention. Steps were placed carefully on each tread, avoiding any unnecessary noise. The hand lightly rested on a banister if needed, fingers adjusting to maintain composure and stability. A misstep could draw attention from other members of the household, servants, or visiting guests, signaling disruption or carelessness, even unintentionally. Rooms themselves were designed to encourage quiet motion. Furniture was arranged to create clear pathways. Tables, chairs, and ottomans were positioned with consideration for flow and movement. Rugs were placed strategically to absorb sound. Even the placement of small objects, books, vases, or decorative boxes was intended to guide steps, ensuring that movement through the house maintained the rhythm of refinement. The expectation of gentle footsteps extended to every member of the household. Children learned to move with soft soles, walking in measured steps from room to room. Their play was carefully moderated so that enthusiasm did not break the decorum of the home. Even running indoors was discouraged, and if it occurred, it was accompanied by immediate correction and gentle reminders to adjust posture and pace. Servants, too, practiced silent motion. Kitchens, pantries, and service areas were designed to allow work to proceed without disrupting the calm of living spaces. Footsteps were minimized. Movements were choreographed to prevent clatter or commotion. Their quiet diligence ensured the home maintained a sense of order and tranquility even during busy times. The concept of quiet movement extended to nighttime routines. Hallways were dimly lit, sometimes only by the soft glow of lamps or candles. Children and adults alike moved with particular care during these hours. A creaking floorboard or sudden sound could disturb others, interrupt sleep, or draw subtle censure. The discipline of moving quietly became ingrained over time, a habit reinforcing awareness and self-control. Even the act of entering or leaving a room was guided by decorum. Doors were opened gently, ensuring hinges did not squeak. Footsteps were lightened before reaching thresholds, acknowledging the shift between spaces. Every movement was accompanied by subtle attention to balance, posture, and rhythm, creating an environment where the presence of a person could be perceived without disturbance. Visitors quickly learned these unspoken expectations upon entering a home. Guests were observed moving carefully across the floor, adjusting pace and softening steps to match the quiet tone of the household. A guest who was unaware or clumsy in this regard could unintentionally reveal unfamiliarity with the social rules, signaling inexperience or disregard. In rooms where conversation occurred, the gentle rhythm of footsteps supported the mood. People moved to sit, to stand, or to adjust positions with almost imperceptible sound. Even when walking across a room to reach a cabinet or pick up an object, the movement was a quiet rehearsal, performed with patience and mindfulness. Footsteps became part of the silent language of the home, communicating calm, attentiveness, and respect. The practice of moving gently extended beyond walking. Actions such as bending to lift an item, shifting a chair, or placing a book on a shelf were performed with deliberate care. The entire body became trained to maintain composure and minimize disruption. Each gesture contributed to an overall sense of harmony, reflecting both personal discipline and adherence to the household's expectations. Carpets and rugs played more than a practical role. They were teachers. Their textures and placement required attention and encouraged light steps. Wooden floors polished to shine, reflected sound and required careful navigation. The home itself was a silent instructor, reminding inhabitants of the importance of restraint and mindful movement at every turn. Children often internalized these lessons gradually. At first, soft movement was practiced consciously. Then, over time, it became instinctual, embedded in posture, gait, and the manner of stepping. Their awareness extended beyond the household to public spaces. Church pews, promenades, and visits to neighbors' homes all demanded the same careful attention to motion. Even in moments of excitement or anticipation, restraint was emphasized. Running to greet a visitor, hurrying to the table, or moving quickly to avoid missing an event was tempered by the learned discipline of quiet motion. Energy had to be balanced with composure, allowing enthusiasm to exist without disrupting the harmony of the surroundings. The role of gentle footsteps also carried social meaning. Quiet movement communicated respect for others, acknowledgement of shared space, and mastery of personal control. In a home where sound was carefully managed, those who could navigate silently demonstrated awareness, training, and refinement. Conversely, heavy, clumsy steps could betray immaturity, inattention, or lack of familiarity with proper decorum. Even the floors themselves became instruments in this education. Some were built with creaking boards, uneven planks, or polished surfaces that magnified every movement. In response, inhabitants adjusted, learning to move with care and precision. Each home taught the rhythm of life, the importance of awareness, and the subtle ways in which behavior could affect others in shared spaces. Over time, the discipline of gentle movement became a broader lesson in Victorian life. Awareness, patience, and attention to detail were reinforced not only in the home but in society at large. The ability to move quietly translated into social grace, refined manners, and the perception of character, forming a foundation for a lifetime of careful, deliberate conduct. Even in solitude, the awareness of steps persisted. Walking through empty halls, one might still place each foot with care, a subconscious reflection of the lessons absorbed over years. Movement became an expression of respect for oneself and one's environment, a quiet demonstration of control, poise, and mindfulness. Footsteps, therefore, were never merely functional. They carried meaning, reflected social education, and reinforced the values of restraint, observation, and care. In Victorian homes, where even the softest sound was noted and interpreted, every step became part of the choreography of life, shaping how individuals moved, thought, and existed within both private and public spheres. In the end, life in a home where footsteps were meant to be gentle was an ongoing exercise in awareness. Each day presented opportunities to practice restraint, refine posture, and navigate shared spaces with quiet attention. The lessons extended beyond the physical. They instilled patience, respect, and a deep understanding of how every action, no matter how small, shaped the experience of living with others, even when the household slept. The memory of careful steps remained. Inhabitants reflected on the rhythm of movement, the soft echoes of the day, and the subtle ways in which they had harmonized with their homes of this kind taught mindfulness in every gesture, creating a foundation of grace, refinement, and quiet attentiveness that permeated Victorian life in ways both visible and unseen. Why emotions were folded away like carefully pressed clothing. In Victorian society, emotions were rarely displayed openly. Feelings were treated much like clothing, to be carefully folded, neatly stored, and revealed only when absolutely necessary. Anger, excitement, sadness, or joy were managed with deliberate restraint, as though every expression might ripple outward and disturb the intricate order of social life. To remain composed was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. Children learned early that open displays of feeling were rarely appropriate. Tears were to be restrained, laughter softened, and frustration tempered with patience. Parents modeled this behavior daily, adjusting posture, tone, and expression, demonstrating that the management of emotion was as vital as the management of the body. Small gestures, an uplifted eyebrow, a faint smile, or a tilt of the head often conveyed what words could not, teaching young observers to recognize subtle cues and internalize restraint. Education in emotional restraint was not cruel but subtle. Tutors and caregivers encouraged reflection before reaction. A child who dropped a plate might be asked to pause, take a breath, and compose themselves before speaking. Joy at a gift was to be expressed with measured gratitude. Disappointment at a denial required quiet acceptance. Through these exercises, the practice of folding emotions away became instinctive, a silent art that governed daily life. Adults practiced the same discipline in every aspect of Victorian living. Public spaces demanded particular vigilance. In drawing rooms, parlors, or church pews, emotions were moderated to avoid disruption or discomfort. A smile was controlled, a laugh measured, and tears concealed with gentle elegance. Even in moments of private grief or joy, the expectation of composure influenced posture, breathing, and the quiet management of inner experience. Letters, too, reflected the careful folding of emotion. Sentiments were expressed with delicacy, often hinted at rather than declared outright. Writers learned to convey affection, concern, or longing through subtle phrasing and carefully chosen words. Emotions were encoded in tone, in the rhythm of sentences, in the spacing between words. Every line of correspondence became an exercise in expressing feeling without overwhelming the recipient or violating the social code of restraint. The metaphor of carefully pressed clothing is apt. Just as garments were folded to preserve shape, prevent wrinkles, and maintain elegance, so too were emotions organized, refined, and hidden from view. A slight crease could hint at unrest, a hidden fold might conceal vulnerability, and the careful arrangement of both attire and feeling signaled attentiveness to propriety. Emotional discipline was as much a visible as an invisible skill, taught, observed, and practiced daily. Even in intimate relationships, restraint was valued. Romantic attachment was expressed in carefully measured gestures, in gentle glances, or in letters composed with subtlety and care. Passion was present but moderated, as unchecked emotion could threaten social standing or personal reputation. Courtship, in particular, demanded precision in both action and feeling. A glance, a gesture, or a touch was calculated to convey interest without excess, to maintain dignity while hinting at personal sentiment. Households enforced these norms, gently yet firmly. Family members observed one another, learning to interpret small signals of emotion. The tilt of a head, a pause in speech, or a faint flush could communicate joy, irritation, or sorrow. Children absorbed these lessons naturally, developing an acute awareness of subtleties in human expression. The discipline of folding emotions away cultivated self-control, empathy, and sensitivity to social context. Public rituals reinforced this emotional restraint. Church attendance, for example, demanded solemnity and quiet reflection. Congregants maintained composed posture, soft voices, and steady gazes. Emotions, if expressed at all, were carefully moderated. Enthusiasm was tempered with decorum, grief contained with reverence, and delight expressed only through subtle gestures. The public display of feeling was a performance, executed with both awareness and respect for the shared space of others. Even moments of private joy were tempered. A child's first success, a small victory in a game, or the receipt of a desired gift was acknowledged with a reserved smile or quiet gratitude rather than boisterous celebration. Adults, too, greeted happiness with measured appreciation, aware that excessive display might invite scrutiny or suggest impropriety. Emotional life was carefully balanced against social expectation. Mourning and grief, Perhaps the most visible of emotional displays were themselves regulated with meticulous attention. Attention, black clothing, subdued speech, and solemn conduct expressed sorrow, yet even these gestures were controlled. Excessive wailing, dramatic gestures, or loud lamentations were discouraged. Grief was to be observed with dignity, folded neatly into behavior, and made socially legible without breaching decorum. The home environment reinforced this subtle management of feeling. Furniture, lighting, and decor all suggested quietude and reflection. Rooms were designed to encourage calm, to facilitate measured conversation, and to support the folding away of intense emotion. Soft carpets, muffled steps, drapes soft sound, and the arrangement of seating created spaces for observation rather than performance. The architecture itself became a tool for cultivating restraint. Servants, too, were trained in the management of emotion. They performed duties with calm composure, hiding irritation, fatigue, or impatience. Their quiet diligence reinforced the household's atmosphere of controlled feeling. The ability to maintain composure while working or interacting with family members or guests was an essential skill, signaling both refinement and reliability. Letters, diaries, and journals became outlets for those who wished to preserve emotions. Privately, individuals could pour their feelings onto paper, safely folded away from public scrutiny. These personal texts allowed for reflection and processing, offering a safe space to record joy, disappointment, love, or grief without violating social expectations. The practice of writing thus complemented the physical folding of emotion into controlled outward expression. Education further emphasized this subtle discipline. Young men and women were instructed in the arts of conversation, music, and behavior, all of which demanded emotional regulation. A piano piece could be played with passion yet controlled technique. A dialogue could convey interest or disapproval without abruptness. Mastery of these arts taught not only skill but also emotional poise. Even clothing, metaphorically, reinforced emotional control. Corsets, gloves, and structured garments constrained physical expression, reflecting and shaping the discipline of the inner life. The careful folding of dresses, the neat arrangement of accessories, and the daily ritual of dressing cultivated both outward appearance and inward restraint. Physical posture and emotional composure became inseparable, each shaping and reflecting the other. Over time, the practice of folding emotions away created individuals capable of navigating complex social networks with grace. The subtle reading of others' expressions, the careful calibration of one's own responses, and the internalization of restraint ensured harmonious interaction across households, neighborhoods, and public spaces. Emotional awareness became both a social skill and a personal discipline. Even in moments of solitude, the lessons of restraint persisted. Reflection, contemplation, and quiet attention to feeling became habits. Emotions could be recognized, measured, and folded away for later expression when appropriate. This internal practice reinforced self-discipline, patience, and mindfulness, shaping personality and social behavior over a lifetime. In essence, Victorian emotional discipline was a deliberate and pervasive form of social education. By learning to fold feelings away like carefully pressed clothing, individuals cultivated patience, awareness, and empathy. They learned the subtle art of signaling, expressing, and withholding, navigating the complex world of manners, propriety, and social expectation with skill and quiet elegance. In households, drawing rooms, and streets, the evidence of this practice was everywhere. Composure in conversation, measured gestures, restrained laughter, and silent observation were visible markers of mastery. Emotions were never erased. They were organized, stored, and released selectively, maintaining harmony both within the self and within society. Through this careful cultivation of restraint, Victorian life balanced inner experience with outer behavior. Feelings were managed, refined, and folded, yet still existed as vital forces shaping thought, action, and social connection. To live in this world was to understand the power of subtlety, the value of patience, and the importance of presenting oneself gracefully, even while the heart moved quietly beneath the surface. In folding away emotion like pressed clothing, Victorians achieved a delicate equilibrium. Their inner lives remained rich, reflective, and sensitive, while outward behavior projected composure, refinement, and harmony. Every gesture, expression, and word became part of the careful choreography of life, ensuring that even the most intense feeling could exist in a measured, socially acceptable form. The strange comfort found in predictable, repeated daily rituals in the Victorian household. Life moved according to a carefully orchestrated pattern, each day defined by routines that were repeated with unwavering precision. The predictable rhythm of domestic life offered a strange but comforting stability, a structure within which both adults and children could navigate their responsibilities, relationships, and personal reflection. These rituals, though outwardly simple, provided a quiet reassurance that the world remained ordered and that social harmony was maintained. Mornings began with gentle awakenings, curtains were drawn to admit soft light, and the household stirred in measured sequence. Servants quietly moved through rooms, opening shutters, lighting fires, and preparing breakfast without disrupting the calm. The sounds of activity soft, footsteps, the careful stirring of porridge, the faint rustle of linens were part of a familiar symphony, signaling the start of the day in a controlled, deliberate manner. Breakfast itself was the arrangement of utensils, the serving of tea or coffee, and the careful placement of plates followed established conventions. Conversation was slow, polite, and measured, ensuring that the morning meal reinforced both social education and familial cohesion. Even the act of taking a sip from a cup or buttering bread carried an expectation of calm, deliberate attention. In these small, repeated actions, inhabitants found reassurance, a sense that life was unfolding correctly, predictably, and safely. Daily rituals extended beyond meals. Household tasks were scheduled with care. Laundry was done on certain days, dusting and polishing followed specific sequences, and letters were written and answered at predetermined times. The rhythm of activity created a sense of mastery over the domestic environment, turning even laborious work into a form of meditation. Attention to detail became habitual, and the satisfaction of completing tasks in order fostered a quiet pride and emotional stability. In families, children adapted to these routines naturally, rising, dressing, attending lessons, and assisting with household chores were embedded into a predictable framework. Repetition, reinforced learning, provided comfort, and created an internalized sense of time. The constancy of rituals reassured children that their world was comprehensible, safe, and navigable, even when external events were unpredictable or stressful. Even the adult day was framed by ritual. Correspondence, reading, walking in the garden, or attending to social obligations occurred within expected temporal boundaries. The predictability of these actions reduced uncertainty, allowing mental and emotional energy to be conserved for careful observation, polite engagement, or reflection. Daily life became a series of rehearsed movements, each reinforcing the calm, controlled environment deemed essential to social and personal well-being. The Victorian emphasis on ritual extended to attire, dressing at specified times, arranging hair or hats according to convention, and ensuring that clothing was maintained in perfect order, all formed part of a structured routine. Garments were folded, brushed, and inspected with care, reinforcing a sense of mastery over personal presentation and, by extension, over one's own environment and behavior. Even leisure was regimented. Afternoon walks, social visits, or private reading were conducted within habitual structures. The paths taken, the order of greetings, and the duration of activities were all predictable, allowing inhabitants to experience both freedom and security within a framework of expectation. Time, though flexible in perception, remained anchored to recognizable rituals, providing comfort in repetition. Meals beyond breakfast followed similar patterns. Luncheon and dinner were marked by careful attention to timing, table arrangement, and manners. The rhythm of conversation mirrored the measured pace of daily life, with pauses observed for reflection and gestures executed with consideration. Each meal became a stage on which the lessons of refinement, observation, and self-restraint were practiced and reinforced. Even the smallest actions contributed to the stability of daily life. Setting a table, tending a fire, or polishing a piece of silver were more than chores. They were components of a repeated pattern that structured the household and reinforced social and personal discipline. The repetition of these acts created a comforting predictability, allowing both servants and family members to navigate the day with confidence. Children's education was interwoven with these daily rhythms. Lessons were conducted at scheduled times, with reading, writing, and arithmetic carefully sequenced. Music, needlework, or drawing were introduced in predictable intervals, training attention, patience, and dexterity. The steady cadence of learning reinforced the broader rhythms of the home, connecting the education of mind and body to the structure of daily life. Even time spent in quiet reflection adhered to ritual. Early morning devotions, evening prayers, or private contemplation at midday provided a rhythm to thought as well as action. In these periods, the mind learned to focus, to assess behavior, and to cultivate a measured emotional response. Repetition in both action and thought reinforced composure, awareness, and the internalization of social expectations. Predictable rituals also extended to the management of social obligations. Invitations, visits, and correspondence occurred within familiar cycles. Understanding the timing and order of these activities allowed individuals to navigate relationships without stress or confusion. The repetition of social etiquette provided reassurance that interactions could proceed smoothly, even amidst complex hierarchies and subtle expectations. Weather and seasonal changes were integrated into daily routines, enhancing their predictability. Garden walks followed the sun, Chores adapted to light and temperature, and clothing shifted according to climatol within the framework of familiar patterns. Nature itself became a rhythm that reinforced household rituals, providing continuity and stability against the unpredictable flow of external events. Even play for children followed structured patterns. Games were selected and scheduled to align with daily routines, ensuring that fun did not disrupt order. The repetition of familiar activities provided comfort, security, and a safe environment in which children could practice social skills, coordination, and patience. In this way, even leisure contributed to the reinforcement of predictable patterns. The comfort of repeated rituals extended to the household staff. Servants developed muscle memory, anticipating the needs of the household through repeated tasks. Their careful attention, ingrained through repetition, ensured that the day unfolded smoothly, with minimal disruption and maximum efficiency. The rhythm of their work became a background music of the home, synchronizing with the actions of family members. In the evenings, predictable rituals continued. Candle lighting, reading aloud, and gentle conversation marked the close of the day. Preparations for bedtime followed precise steps, arranging bedding, checking fires, and ensuring household security. Each action, though mundane, was performed with care, reinforcing the sense that life, however complex, could be managed, ordered, and understood through repetition. Even celebrations and special occasions were integrated into structured patterns. Guests were invited at prescribed times, meals served according to convention, and conversation guided by subtle expectations. The predictability of these social rituals allowed participants to feel at ease, knowing the steps, expectations, and order of events. Even novelty was cushioned by the framework of routine, providing a comforting bridge between excitement and stability. Through repetition, daily life in Victorian households became a source of quiet assurance. Individuals could anticipate what would happen next, plan accordingly, and move through the day with a sense of security. The predictability of action offered a counterbalance to uncertainty, a reminder that, despite external complexity, internal order could be maintained. Even in reflection, the comfort of repeated rituals was evident. Inhabitants would recall the steady rhythm of days gone by, the unfolding of tasks in familiar order, and the reassurance of controlled, deliberate activity. These memories reinforced the sense of stability, embedding the value of routine deep within both thought and behavior. The cumulative effect of repeated rituals shaped both character and perception. Patience, mindfulness, attention to detail, and composure were reinforced through repetition. Individuals learned to find serenity in predictability, to value the harmony of order, and to appreciate the subtle rhythms of life that connected body, mind, and society. In essence, Victorian daily rituals, meals, chores, education, social interactions, and private reflection were far more than mere habits. They were the scaffolding of emotional and social stability, offering comfort in their constancy, shaping personality, and providing a framework in which life could be lived gracefully, deliberately, and with reassuring predictability. Servants, bells, and the silent language of household hierarchy. In a Victorian household, the unseen rhythms of life were often dictated not by the family themselves, but by the servants who moved silently through the house, guided by the discreet ringing of bells and a highly structured hierarchy. Each chime, each signal, and each quiet gesture communicated tasks, priorities, and expectations without a single spoken word. The household operated as a network of subtle cues, with servants attuned to the invisible rules that kept life orderly and efficient. Bells were the primary language of communication within the house. Small brass or iron bells, discreetly mounted in walls or on cupboards, conveyed instructions from upstairs to downstairs. A single ring could summon a footman to the drawing room. A series of gentle taps might signal that dinner was ready. Each bell pattern was learned through repetition and careful observation, becoming second nature to those who served. Understanding the code of bells was a form of literacy, a mastery of silent communication that reinforced hierarchy, order, and decorum. Hierarchy among servants was equally precise. The butler oversaw the male staff, coordinating tasks, prioritizing duties, and ensuring that the family's expectations were met without delay or error. The housekeeper managed the female staff, supervising cleaning, laundry, and the maintenance of linens. Junior staff learned through careful observation and subtle correction, absorbing the unspoken rules that governed both behavior and interaction. Every movement was observed, every gesture interpreted, and each individual adjusted accordingly. The silent language of the household extended beyond bells. Footfalls, the rustle of clothing, and the subtle positioning of objects conveyed meaning. A servant's presence could be felt without being seen. A gesture could indicate readiness, request, or acknowledgement. Through these quiet cues, the household functioned as a seamless organism, each member performing assigned roles with precision, ensuring that the family experienced comfort, efficiency, and order without the intrusion of overt instruction. Each day began with a series of choreographed routines. Early morning calls from the bells signaled the start of movement. Footmen dressed in crisp livery retrieved fresh water, lit fires, and ensured that the family's morning was attended to with seamless care. Maids prepared bedrooms, drew curtains, and arranged clothing, their movements swift yet silent, almost invisible to the household's eyes. Every action was calibrated to maximize efficiency while minimizing disruption. The subtlety of movement was paramount. Servants learned to anticipate needs, moving before commands were given, reading facial expressions, gestures, and even postures to understand the desires of the family. A shift in weight, a raised hand, or a lingering glance could initiate action. Over time, this silent communication created an almost telepathic understanding within the household staff, allowing the home to function with fluid precision. Meal service was an especially intricate demonstration of hierarchy and silent coordination. The butler and footman prepared the dining room meticulously, arranging silver, glassware, and linens. In strict adherence to etiquette, plates were brought to the table with exacting care, positioned according to seating plans that reflected social rank and gender. Even the smallest action, a tilt of the tray, a slight adjustment of a nap, awareness and competence. The family experienced seamless service without ever needing to give direct instructions. In the drawing room, similar precision applied. Servants adjusted furniture, arranged books or writing materials, and maintained lighting without speaking. Their presence was almost imperceptible, a quiet framework supporting the activities of the family. The hierarchy of tasks ensured that no motion was unnecessary, no space cluttered, and no household rhythm disrupted. Every servant knew the boundaries of action and the expectations of observation, reinforcing a culture of silent awareness. Bells also marked transitions in the day. Afternoon tea, the arrival of guests, or the call for evening prayers were all coordinated through subtle signals. The sequence of ringing, combined with visual cues such as glances or nods, ensured that the household adapted seamlessly to changes in activity. These rituals reinforced both the social hierarchy and the disciplined functioning of domestic life, with efficiency achieved through subtlety rather than spoken orders. Servants learned to manage emotional labor alongside physical labor, maintaining composure, smiling discreetly, and responding politely while performing tasks required constant attention. Any display of impatience or frustration could disrupt the harmony of the household. The silent communication of status, expectation, and readiness through gestures, glances, or posture was as vital as the execution of the chores themselves. Training new staff involved careful mentoring. Junior servants observed seniors, mimicking posture, pace, and subtle hand movements. Mistakes were corrected quietly, often through demonstration rather than verbal reprimand. Over time, this apprenticeship created a workforce capable of anticipating and fulfilling needs without disturbance, reinforcing both hierarchy and efficiency. The home became a microcosm of subtle power, where knowledge of the unspoken code determined influence and effectiveness. Even the architecture of the home supported this silent communication. Bell pulls were positioned strategically near bedrooms, drawing rooms, and kitchens. Hallways were designed to allow unobtrusive movement, with stairs placed to minimize disruption. Servants adapted to these structural cues, learning the precise locations for action, observation, and readiness. Every aspect of the building reinforced the unspoken choreography of household life. Interaction with family members required additional finesse. Servants responded to gestures, facial expressions, and tone of voice, calibrating responses to reflect appropriate deference, efficiency, and discretion. The slightest misinterpretation could result in embarrassment, delay, or social discomfort. Mastery of this silent language was not optional. It was essential to maintaining social harmony and household reputation. Even emergencies were handled within the framework of hierarchy and silent signals. A sudden illness, an unexpected visitor, or a broken fixture demanded swift action. Servants moved according to learned protocol, communicating urgency through movement, posture, or bell signals, rather than overt speech. Their efficiency preserved the calm and order of the household, demonstrating the indispensable role of trained observation and subtle coordination. The family's perception of household order relied on these silent cues. Because servants moved with discretion, the home appeared serene and effortless, masking the complex coordination underlying daily life. This invisible network of communication ensured that the family experienced comfort, stability, and predictability, reinforcing the value of hierarchy and disciplined observation. Guests were quickly initiated into this system, observing the seamless service, the discreet positioning of staff, and the subtle signals of readiness. They became aware of the unspoken rules governing movement, attention, and interaction. Visiting families recognized the skill involved in silent orchestration, appreciating the balance between visibility and invisibility in household management. Even leisure activities were shaped by this hierarchy. Reading, music, and conversation were supported by unseen servants, whose attentiveness ensured that silence and comfort prevailed. Chairs were adjusted, fire screens placed, and refreshments delivered with minimal intrusion. Every gesture, movement, and response was calibrated to maintain an environment conducive to polite engagement at night. The rhythm of service followed similarly precise patterns. Lights were extinguished gradually, fires banked, and beds prepared according to strict standards. Bells and silent cues marked the conclusion of the day, signaling to servants that tasks were complete while preserving household calm. The mastery of this silent language ensured continuity, reliability, and the smooth transition between day and night. In the end, the interplay of servants, bells, and hierarchy exemplified the hidden architecture of Victorian domestic life. Through subtle observation, disciplined movement, and an intricate system of signals, the household operated with seamless efficiency. Silent language governed the actions of both servants and family, demonstrating the sophistication and subtlety of a world where communication extended far beyond words. Through this invisible network, the home maintained order, comfort, and grace. Every ring of a bell, every quiet step, and every subtle gesture reinforced social structure, discipline, and harmony. Understanding and mastering this silent language was essential for survival, success, and the cultivation of respect within the complex world of Victorian domestic life. Evening hours filled with lamps, shadows, and unspoken thoughts. As the Victorian day drew to a close, the household transitioned into a different rhythm, guided by the soft glow of lamps, the lengthening shadows, and the quiet weight of unspoken thoughts. Evening hours were a time of reflection, subtle ritual, and measured interaction. A pause in the rhythm of daily tasks where both family and servants adjusted to the soft, muted cadence of night. Lamps were lit carefully. Each flame tended to produce a gentle, even light, casting soft shadows that stretched across walls, floors, and furniture, marking the slow descent from activity into contemplation. In drawing rooms, parlors, and studies, lamps were positioned with precision, balancing illumination with shadow to create an environment conducive to calm observation and subtle communication. The play of light and darkness encouraged introspection, allowing household members to review the day, contemplate social interactions, and prepare mentally for the tasks of tomorrow. Shadows themselves became companions of the evening, extending the sense of quiet, measured space, and giving a gentle rhythm to the visual landscape. Evening conversation was deliberate and subdued. Voices were lowered, gestures minimized, and topics chosen with care. Social niceties were observed, and each exchange was calibrated to reflect respect, propriety, and the unspoken codes of interaction. Family members learned to communicate, not only through words but through posture, expression, and the subtle interplay of movement and stillness. Thoughts often remained private, folded away with the same care as daytime emotions, leaving a serene, contemplative atmosphere to settle over the home. Children, too, experienced the evening in this carefully curated manner. Play was slowed or concluded, lessons were reviewed, and reading became a quiet pursuit. In the gentle lamplight, the pages of books and letters reflected the soft glow, offering comfort and stability. The repetition of these evening activities reinforced daily routines, creating a predictable environment in which both children and adults could feel secure and oriented. Servants moved with continued discretion during evening hours. Fires were stoked with care, tea or refreshments prepared, and rooms arranged for comfort, all without disturbing the quietude of the household. Footsteps were softened, hands moved deliberately, and the ringing of bells minimized, allowing the household to transition into night seamlessly. The hierarchy and silent language of the home persisted, even in these hours of muted reflection, ensuring that the rhythm of domestic life remained uninterrupted. The interplay of lamps and shadows had a subtle psychological effect. The gradual fading of daylight and the rise of artificial illumination created a sense of intimacy and enclosure, fostering contemplation and quiet interaction. Household members learned to navigate the shifting patterns of light, interpreting the forms of shadow as cues for movement, conversation, and observation. The interplay of brightness and dimness mirrored the subtlety with which emotions and thoughts were expressed, reinforcing a culture of measured behavior. Evening rituals included careful preparation for the night. Beds were arranged, clothing set in order, and fires banked to provide warmth without excessive noise. Candles or oil lamps were trimmed to minimize flickering, providing steady illumination that suggested calm and composure. These preparations were as much about discipline as they were about comfort, reinforcing the sense that life, even in rest, was guided by structure, awareness, and mindfulness. Reading, writing, and reflection were central to the evening hours. Journals were updated, letters composed, and books explored in quiet contemplation. The subdued environment fostered concentration, allowing both young and old to engage with ideas, emotions, and observations with minimal distraction. This discipline of thought complemented the physical discipline practiced throughout the day, integrating mental, emotional, and social refinement. Family interactions were shaped by this subtle evening rhythm. Conversations often revolved around reflection on the day's events, careful discussion of future plans, or measured observation of social matters. Silence was as valued as speech. Pauses were meaningful, and the absence of sound could communicate as much as words themselves. By evening, the household had learned to operate in a space where subtlety, awareness, and restraint governed every action and interaction. Guests present during evening hours experienced the household differently than during the day. The soft light, measured conversation, and attentive service created an atmosphere of calm, contemplation, and subtle social signaling. Every gesture, every movement, and every glance carried significance, yet all remained understated. Visitors became attuned to the delicate choreography of evening life, learning the unspoken codes that guided both family and staff. Evening meals were a quieter affair, reflecting both completion and reflection. Candles or lamps provided illumination without harshness. Table service was conducted with discretion, and conversation flowed in measured tones. The ritual of dining in the evening reinforced both social and personal discipline, teaching observation, patience, and awareness. Each step, from the placement of utensils to the timing of remarks, was guided by silent understanding and subtle coordination. For children, bedtime was structured and predictable. Lessons concluded, clothing arranged for the night, and bedtime prayers or reflections provided a final framework for the day. These routines cultivated security, patience, and a sense of continuity, while also teaching the importance of closing the day with composure and order. Even the act of lying down to sleep was infused with ritual, a deliberate transition from activity to rest. Servants' nighttime duties were similarly guided by subtlety and hierarchy. Chambers were prepared, fires adjusted, and final tasks completed with minimal intrusion. The household's rhythm persisted, ensuring that family members experienced both comfort and continuity. Silent communication, discreet observation, and attention to minute detail allowed the evening to pass without disruption. reinforcing the mastery of unspoken coordination and expectation. Even in moments of solitude, the evening encouraged reflection. Individuals could consider the events of the day, assess personal behavior, and contemplate social interactions, all under the calm influence of lamplight and shadows. This quiet time reinforced mindfulness, awareness, and internal discipline, providing a counterbalance to the activity and attention demanded during daylight hours. Letters written in the evening often carried careful thought, subtlety, and a depth of observation impossible during busier hours. Writers adjusted tone, phrasing, and formality to suit both content and recipient, expressing emotion within the constraints of social propriety. The quiet, structured environment supported reflection, ensuring that communication was precise, thoughtful, and measured. Music, when performed, was softened by the intimate glow of lamps. Piano notes, singing, or chamber instruments were played with measured care, producing an atmosphere of calm, refinement, and subtle emotional resonance. The interaction between light, shadow, and sound enhanced the contemplative nature of the evening, shaping both perception and emotional response in ways that reinforced social and personal discipline. Observing shadows offered subtle instruction in movement, posture, and awareness. Individuals became attuned to the way gestures appeared under lamplight, refining the control of expression, hand movement, and posture. Shadows provided immediate feedback, an extension of social expectation into the visual environment, teaching mindfulness without words or correction. Evening walks in private gardens or along terraces followed similarly careful patterns. Paths were chosen for predictability and calm, conversation minimized, and pace measured. The rhythm of lamplight or moonlight provided both guidance and comfort, extending the household's discipline and reflection into the outdoor spaces. Steps were light, postures controlled, and observation heightened, creating a bridge between the interior rituals and the external environment. By the end of the evening, the household had entered a state of deliberate quietude. Lamps illuminated rooms with soft, even light. Shadows danced gently across walls. Unspoken thoughts were folded into posture, gaze, and gesture. The day's activities, discipline, and attention to subtle cues culminated in an atmosphere of calm, reflection, and measured awareness. Even as individuals retired to their private chambers, the lessons of evening persisted. Reflection, composure, and awareness had become habitual, shaping both perception and behavior. The interplay of light and shadow, the rhythm of movement, and the discipline of unspoken thought reinforced the Victorian ideals of poise, mindfulness, and subtlety. In these quiet hours, life unfolded as a careful balance between presence and reflection, observation, and contemplation. The household had learned to navigate not only tasks and social obligations, but also the deeper currents of thought, emotion, and interpersonal understanding, all within the gentle structure of lamplit evenings. How loneliness hid inside a world that looked perfect from outside. At first glance, a Victorian household could appear to an outsider as the very image of perfection. Gleaming floors, meticulously arranged furniture, carefully pressed clothing, and impeccably polite interactions among family members and guests. Every meal, walk, and social engagement seemed to unfold with precision, like the notes of a finely tuned instrument. Yet beneath this facade of order and refinement, a subtler, quieter reality often thrived. Loneliness. Loneliness in Victorian society was rarely acknowledged. Social expectations demanded that individuals maintain composure, grace, and adherence to the rules of etiquette, leaving little room for the open discussion of emotional isolation. A household could hum with activity, servants attending to every detail and family members engaging in measured conversation. And yet each individual might experience a profound sense of isolation. Thoughts, desires, or fears were folded away, carefully concealed, as though exposing them might disturb the carefully orchestrated balance of social life. Children often felt the sting of this concealed solitude first. Though surrounded by family and attendants, they were expected to entertain themselves quietly, manage their emotions, and perform daily routines with patience and attention. Play was structured or limited by adult supervision. Lessons followed. Strict sequences and displays of excessive joy or frustration were discouraged. In this environment, children learned to occupy their minds with observation and reflection, cultivating self-reliance, but also experiencing a subtle loneliness that few could name aloud. Adults, too, encountered this hidden isolation. Marriage, family life, and social interaction were all governed by layers of ritual, expectation, and silent etiquette. Conversations often remained superficial, governed by politeness rather than personal connection. Guests were entertained with cordiality, neighbors observed with discretion, and public behavior was maintained with meticulous care. The expectation to appear composed and agreeable left little space for the acknowledgement of personal longing, doubt, or sadness. Within the home, physical proximity did not guarantee emotional closeness. Family members might share meals, rooms, or even walks, yet communication often remained formal, measured, and carefully controlled. Emotional expression was disciplined, leaving a quiet gap between individuals. Gestures of affection were subtle, measured, and often mediated by ritual. A nod, a polite smile, or a fleeting touch, each carefully modulated to conform to social expectation. These small interactions, while socially acceptable, could never fully bridge the emotional distance cultivated by convention. Servants, too, navigated a world of controlled social interaction. They were present in every aspect of daily life, attending to needs, preparing meals, and maintaining household order. Yet they were rarely invited into genuine personal connection with the family they served. Their relationships with one another were also regulated by hierarchy and observation, limiting spontaneous friendship or camaraderie. In the quiet corners of a bustling household, servants, like family members, often experienced a profound solitude, present yet unseen. Letters provided one of the few outlets for expressing unspoken thoughts, yet even written communication was tempered by decorum, often hinting at feeling, rather than declaring it outright. Writers learned to encode affection, longing, or melancholy in subtle phrasing, delicate punctuation, and careful word choice. Though these missives offered a form of connection, the act of writing itself underscored the emotional distance maintained by social expectation. One could communicate without truly bridging the gap between self and other. The structure and predictability of Victorian life both alleviated and exacerbated loneliness. Routines offered comfort, minimizing uncertainty and providing a framework for daily existence. Yet this very structure also constrained spontaneous interaction, limiting opportunities for genuine emotional exchange. A well-ordered day could conceal an interior world of longing, reflection, or quiet dissatisfaction, leaving the individual isolated even amid apparent harmony. Even leisure activities carried the imprint of this subtle separation. Music, reading, or contemplative walks were enjoyed within strict temporal and social boundaries. Individuals might share a room, a melody, or a book, but their engagement remained shaped by ritual rather than direct emotional connection. The very predictability and refinement of these activities reinforced a subtle distance, allowing loneliness to persist beneath a veneer of propriety and shared experience. Even within intimate relationships, such as marriage, emotional isolation could be profound. Husbands and wives were bound by expectation, decorum, and subtle negotiation of power. Affection was expressed with care, often mediated through ritual and convention, rather than direct verbal or physical intimacy. Partners were expected to maintain composure, reserve, and politeness, even in moments of private conversation, preserving a quiet emotional gap that rarely found acknowledgement. The architecture of Victorian homes further reinforced this concealed loneliness. Rooms were designed for functionality, privacy, and social presentation, often creating physical separation that mirrored emotional distance. High walls, corridors, and discreet doors allowed for control over movement, sound, and observation, but also limited spontaneous interaction. The very design of space encouraged order and propriety, while leaving space for isolation to flourish quietly. Even celebrations and social gatherings could not fully dispel this solitude. Guests were entertained with courtesy and charm, yet conversations remained polite and structured. The need to maintain appearances often prevented genuine vulnerability or candid expression. Laughter, smiles, and refined manners provided the illusion of connection, masking the subtle currents of loneliness flowing beneath the surface. Religious observance offered both solace and a reminder of separation. Church attendance provided community, ritual, and shared experience, yet personal reflection, guilt, or longing remained internalized. Private prayer, contemplation, and ritualized meditation emphasized individual responsibility and introspection, highlighting the private nature of emotional experience. In such moments, solitude was both comforting and acute, blending security with a sense of personal isolation. Loneliness was often mediated through structured creativity. Music, poetry, drawing, and other private arts offered channels for expression that did not breach social convention. Individuals could explore thought, emotion, and imagination without fear of judgment. Though such pursuits remained solitary, these creative outlets allowed for personal fulfillment, reflection, and the cultivation of inner life. Yet they also underscored the distance between internal experience and social reality. Servants' quarters, often separated from the family's living spaces, mirrored this dynamic on a smaller scale. Staff experienced community with one another, yet hierarchy, observation, and expectation limited free emotional expression. Conversations were measured, gestures controlled, and moments of levity brief. Within these bounds, loneliness coexisted with efficiency, discipline, and the quiet satisfaction of competence. Children, entering adolescence, began to navigate the duality of connection and isolation with increasing awareness. Schooling, lessons, and social interactions reinforced the importance of etiquette and observation, often constraining emotional spontaneity. Friendships were forged cautiously, carefully modulated, and filtered through social rules. Loneliness could persist even among peers, masked by politeness, shared routines, and the silent acknowledgement of boundaries. Even in old age, the pattern persisted. Adults reflected on lives shaped by expectation, routine, and restraint. Relationships, though outwardly harmonious, often carried the weight of unspoken desire, unexpressed grief, or internal struggle. Loneliness, though subtle, was an enduring companion, present in moments of quiet reflection, solitary walks, or private contemplation. The outward perfection of life masked the complex emotional realities residing beneath. Ultimately, Victorian society excelled at creating the appearance of perfection. Homes, families, routines, and interactions were polished, predictable, and meticulously maintained. Yet the very mechanisms that created this order, ritual, etiquette, hierarchy, and emotional discipline also fostered hidden isolation. Loneliness was woven into the fabric of daily life, present in the careful pauses between words, the disciplined gestures of affection, and the interior landscapes of private thought. Within this world, mastery of observation, patience, and subtle communication allowed individuals to navigate daily life successfully, yet the shadow of solitude remained ever present. Loneliness did not disrupt social function. Instead, it existed quietly, folded into the rhythms, rituals, and expectations that defined Victorian experience. The perfect exterior, for all its elegance, concealed a landscape of private reflection, restrained emotion, and subtle emotional distance. Even amid bustling households, repeated rituals, and the presence of family and staff, individuals experienced this hidden isolation. It was a quiet companion, shaping behavior, reflection, and personal development. To live in such a world was to understand the value of appearance, the discipline of restraint, and the pervasive presence of loneliness. Hidden beneath propriety. The quiet ending of a day that began again exactly the same way. As the Victorian day drew to its quiet conclusion, the household settled into the familiar rhythm that had guided it from morning. The soft lamplight flickered gently, casting long, gentle shadows across polished floors, curtains, and walls. Every object, every gesture, and every subtle movement carried the weight of practice, tradition, and routine, reinforcing a sense of order and stability that had endured all day. Even as the house grew still, life continued to flow in invisible currents, guided by custom, observation, and the silent understanding of social rules. The family's evening rituals, though familiar, were experienced with a sense of completion and reflection. Children, having been guided through lessons, play, and careful attention to propriety, now lay in their beds, the folds of their nightclothes arranged with care, eyes heavy with the comfort of predictability. Their rooms were orderly, the quiet hum of the household below a gentle reassurance that life moved on as expected. Even in rest, the lessons of decorum, attention, and patience had taken root, shaping both thought and behavior. Adults moved through the final tasks of the day with practiced precision. Fires were banked, writing materials stowed, and clothing arranged for the next morning. Conversations, if any remained, were brief, polite, and measured, reflecting the unspoken understanding that the household's rhythm demanded calm closure. Reflections, quietly internalized, were folded into posture, gaze, and gesture, leaving each individual prepared to greet the repetition of the day with composure and grace. The servants, too, performed their final duties with subtle efficiency. Doors were secured, lamps extinguished or trimmed, and floors swept of the faint traces of movement. Their actions were deliberate but unobtrusive, ensuring that the house remained in perfect order. The hierarchy, the silent language of bells and gestures, and the subtle awareness of need had guided them all day, and now allowed the household to settle seamlessly into night. Though their presence was quiet, their skill and attention had shaped the very essence of domestic harmony. Even the household objects seemed to participate in the evening's calm. Tables, chairs, and polished silverware stood in precise alignment. Books rested carefully on shelves, pages marked by gentle folds or reminders of quiet study. Curtains fell in measured folds, reflecting the light of the fading lamps. Every element, though inanimate, participated in a network of order and subtle instruction, ensuring continuity between days and reinforcing the rhythm of life itself. Outside, the world beyond the home's walls began its own slow transition. The streets, once filled with the muted clatter of carriages and the measured footsteps of passers-by, grew still under the quieting influence of evening. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestones, casting long shadows that mimicked the calm inside. Nature, too, participated in this ritual as the moon rose and stars emerged, bathing the city in silvered light. Within this external stillness, the household's ordered quietude was mirrored, a reflection of the same patience and attention that governed life indoors. Even the family's thoughts followed the day's disciplined cadence. Reflection, anticipation, and recollection unfolded quietly, structured by the lessons and expectations internalized over years of ritual. Each individual considered both private concerns and social obligations, balancing the weight of emotion with the discipline of restraint. Memory and imagination moved in parallel to daily activity, providing a subtle continuity that prepared the mind for the inevitable repetition of tomorrow. Evening. Conversation, if it occurred, remained subdued, polite, and deliberate. A few gentle exchanges might pass between family members, each word chosen carefully, tone measured, and gesture restrained. Silences, far from empty, were loaded with meaning, allowing unspoken thoughts, mutual understanding, and emotional nuance to persist without intrusion. In this carefully orchestrated environment, even absence of speech was an expression of connection and awareness. Music, if present, was soft and deliberate. The piano keys moved under delicate fingers, producing melodies that filled rooms without overpowering them. Singing, when it occurred, was controlled and harmonious, blending with the rhythm of shadows, light, and domestic calm. Even in leisure, the household remained bound by routine, subtle hierarchy, and an unspoken agreement that the day's final moments should be measured, deliberate, and reflective. The household's external relationships, long nurtured through letters, visits, and social ritual, had their echoes in these quiet hours. Reflections on interactions, observations of politeness, and anticipation of future encounters were woven into evening thought. Every gesture observed during the day, every carefully measured word, became a reference point in memory, shaping the individual's understanding of both self and society. Loneliness, companionship, reflection, and discipline existed side by side in a delicate balance, reinforced by the repetition of routine. In this evening stillness, the distinction between movement and reflection, action and thought, became subtle and deliberate. Walking quietly across polished floors, adjusting a lamp, or arranging linens was not only functional, but also reflective, a continuation of the day's lessons in observation, patience, and decorum. Even these seemingly mundane tasks carried the weight of discipline and meaning, creating a bridge between activity and contemplation. Nightfall also reinforced the passage of time, yet suggested continuity rather than change. Clocks ticked softly, the household structure remained intact, and the same rituals that began at dawn were already being prepared for tomorrow. In the repetition of time, there was a strange comfort, the knowledge that days would unfold predictably, that lessons of behavior and propriety would continue, and that life, though disciplined, could be navigated with quiet confidence. Beds were prepared with meticulous care, linens were smoothed, pillows fluffed, and curtains drawn to provide privacy and warmth. The act of arranging sleep became ritualized, embedding calm, discipline, and reflection into the very threshold between wakefulness and rest. Even in these small gestures, the principles of observation, anticipation, and attention to subtlety were reinforced, preparing both children and adults for another day of controlled activity and careful living. Servants concluded their evening tasks with discretion, ensuring that all lights were trimmed, fires banked, and necessary preparations for morning completed. Their silent presence, often unnoticed by family members, was essential to the continuity and harmony of household life. Through their careful attention, the seamless perfection of domestic rhythm was preserved, allowing each morning to begin with the same quiet assurance that the day before had ended as the household drifted toward sleep. The room seemed to breathe with the cumulative rhythm of the day. Footsteps, voices, and gestures had all subsided into gentle memory. Lamps cast their final glow, shadows settled into corners, and a calm continuity pervaded each space. The discipline of the day, the careful choreography of action, and the quiet cultivation of observation had created an environment both secure and reflective, a household balanced delicately between order and humanity. Even in stillness, there was preparation for the morning, clothing set aside, schedules anticipated, and the mind quietly rehearsing tasks and interactions all indicated that the day's end was also the day's beginning. The cycle, measured, deliberate, and comforting, reinforced both stability and expectation. Individuals could rest knowing that the careful rhythm of life would resume with the same precision, offering continuity and reassurance. At last, as the household embraced its final moments of evening, a sense of serene closure prevailed. Shadows stretched and soft, lamps dimmed with gentle care, and quiet reflection became the final ritual of the day. Individuals, both young and old, found solace in predictability, comfort in routine, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from a life lived with attention, discipline, and subtle grace. In the Victorian household, the end of the day was never abrupt. It concluded with the same thoughtfulness and care that had guided every moment, a gentle alignment of objects, measured movements, and an awareness that the world, though complex, could be navigated with skill, observation, and patience. Tomorrow would begin exactly as today had started, yet each repetition carried the subtle refinement of experience, memory, and learned composure. The quiet ending of the day was more than a conclusion. It was a moment of reflection, a gentle meditation on the harmony of order, the lessons of ritual, and the invisible currents of discipline and care that shaped life. Shadows, light, movement, and stillness intertwined, creating a final tableau of Victorian grace. And as the household drifted into sleep, the world outside might have seemed as calm and perfect as the one within, though only those living its measured rhythm fully understood the depth, care, and subtle poetry of this quiet, disciplined life.